What happens when this woman who owns everything looks at a man who has nothing left to lose and sees the only person worth having? Ethan Calloway didn't walk into that gala looking for a second chance. He walked in smelling like salt water and machine oil, wearing a borrowed shirt, carrying the quiet grief of a man who had already buried the best part of his life. Victoria Sterling didn't go looking for someone to shake her world loose. She had a company to save, wolves at the boardroom table, and no time for distraction. But one sentence, spoken low, almost accidentally, changed everything, and nothing about what followed was clean or easy or fair. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The harbor smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. That particular kind of pressure sat low over the water on autumn evenings in Charleston, the air turning thick and copper-tasting, the light going strange and orange between the cranes. The men who worked the Calloway docks, which everyone still called that even though the Calloway family hadn't owned them in years, they knew that smell. They knew what it meant. Something's coming, batten down. Ethan Calloway had been reading that sky for 11 years. He was 32 years old and looked it in the hands. Calloused palms, knuckles that cracked in cold weather, a scar along his right thumb from a winch cable that had slipped when he was 24, and cocky enough to think he didn't need gloves. His face was something else. His face was younger than his hands by about a decade, which was the opposite of most men his age, and it confused people when they first met him. He had dark eyes that stayed very still when he was thinking, a jaw that needed shaving every day whether he got around to it or not, and the kind of quiet that people sometimes mistook for stupidity until he opened his mouth. He wasn't stupid, he just didn't see the point in talking when he didn't have anything to say. Tonight, though, he was surrounded by people who had plenty to say, and most of it was useless. Sterling Maritime's annual gala had been moved this year from the rooftop venue downtown to the actual shipyard, a decision that Victoria Sterling had apparently made herself over the objection of at least 3 event coordinators and her head of PR. Ethan had heard about it secondhand from Marcus Webb, the dock foreman, who had relayed it with the bemused expression of a man who had seen many things in his years working the harbor, but never quite this. "She wants the employees there," Marcus had said, squinting at the memo. "Not just the executives, actual dock workers, machinists, the whole operation." "Why?" Marcus had shrugged. "Says the company was built by these people and they should be part of celebrating it." Ethan had nodded and said nothing because there wasn't much to say to that. It was either a genuine sentiment or good optics, and he'd find out which soon enough. The yard had been transformed in a way that was impressive and slightly unsettling, the way it is when you know a place intimately and then see it dressed up for company. String lights hung between the crane arms. Long tables with white linens occupied the space between Dry Dock 2 and the main fabrication building. A temporary bar had been assembled near the water's edge, and a small jazz quartet played something unhurried near the far end. The smell of the harbor, brine and diesel and old rope, competed with whatever catering had been brought in, and the harbor was winning. Ethan stood near the outer edge of the crowd, a glass of something sparkling in his hand that he hadn't asked for and wasn't drinking, and watched the gathering with the detached attention of a man who was there because not being there would have looked strange, not because he wanted to be. He wore a dark shirt that his neighbor Mrs. Alcott had insisted on ironing because, she said, "Ethan James Calloway, you are not going to a company event looking like you pulled that out of the dryer with your foot." He'd let her iron it. It seemed easier. She looked after his daughter on evenings like this, and arguing with her about ironing felt like a poor return on the favor. His daughter, Lily, 7 years old, currently asleep in Mrs. Alcott's spare room with her stuffed rabbit and her absolute certainty that the world was navigable if you paid attention to it. Ethan thought about her the way he always thought about her when he was somewhere else, with a low, constant awareness, like a compass needle that never fully rested. "You know you're allowed to actually eat the food," said a voice beside him. He turned. Marcus Webb had materialized at his elbow with a plate and the expression of a man who had found the acceptable distance between mingling and hiding. "I'm fine," Ethan said. "You've been standing in this exact spot for 20 minutes. "I'm observing." "Observing what exactly?" Ethan nodded toward the far end of the gathering, where a group of men in better suits than anything in this zip code were clustered around the bar. "Those guys," Marcus looked, "board members, and that one in the center. That's Victor Langford, chairman. I know who he is. Victor Langford was in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the posture of a man who had spent decades being agreed with. He was laughing at something one of the other men had said, and even from this distance there was something performative about it, the laugh landing half a beat too late, like it had been calculated rather than felt. "He been around much lately?" Ethan asked. "More than usual. He and two of the other board members have been in meetings with the CFO every week for the past month." Marcus ate something off his plate. "Word is they're talking to outside investors." "What kind of investors?" "The kind that buy things." Ethan let that settle. He looked back at Langford. Langford said something to the man on his left, and both of them glanced briefly toward the main building, and something in Ethan's chest registered the direction of that glance the way it registered weather. Instinct rather than logic. "Where's Sterling?" he asked. "Haven't seen her yet." Marcus paused. "You've met her?" "No." "Huh." Marcus looked at him sideways. "The way you said that, I thought maybe." "I know the company, doesn't mean I know the person." That was mostly true. What Ethan knew about Victoria Sterling was what anyone who'd worked the yard for 3 years knew. That she'd taken over the company at 26 after her father's death, that she'd kept it running through 2 difficult years when everyone expected it to fold, that she had a reputation for showing up unannounced on the docks and asking questions that made middle managers nervous. He'd seen her at a distance twice. He hadn't spoken to her. The jazz quartet shifted into something slower. Around the tables, conversation softened with the music. And then someone near the building's entrance said something. And the particular ripple of attention that moves through a room when the most important person in it arrives, that specific, almost physical realignment, moved through the gathering. Victoria Sterling walked out of the building and into the harbor light. She wasn't what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said precisely what he'd expected. She was 30 years old, which he knew from the company profile that had circulated when she'd taken over, and she carried herself with the contained authority of someone who had spent years learning not to take up too much space in rooms that hadn't been designed for her. She wore a dark dress that was formal enough for the occasion without being theatrical about it, and her dark hair was pulled back in a way that looked deliberately practical rather than deliberate. She shook hands as she moved through the crowd, and the handshakes were real, not the limp, distracted grip of someone enduring obligation, but the kind where you could see the attention behind them. What Ethan noticed, though, was the moment she cleared the cluster of executives who had converged on her at the entrance. She stepped past them with the easy precision of someone practiced at exactly that maneuver, and for just a second she stopped moving entirely and looked out at the yard. The lights strung between the cranes, the dark water beyond, the workers standing alongside board members in their good shirts, and her expression did something complicated. Something between pride and grief, maybe. The look of someone seeing a place they love while simultaneously knowing it's in danger. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then someone touched her arm and she turned and was the CEO again. Ethan looked away. "She looks tired," Marcus said quietly. "Yeah," Ethan said. He didn't go looking for another position. He stayed at the edge of the party and watched the water and drank about half of whatever was in his glass and thought about Lily and the storm that the sky had been promising all day. He'd left the smaller tenders tied with double lines just in case. He'd have to check in the morning. He was thinking about the lines, specifically about whether the knots on the port side cleats were going to hold if the wind came in at an angle the way it sometimes did in October, when someone walked up beside him and stood there in a silence that was somehow different from other people's silence. He turned. Victoria Sterling was standing 18 inches away, holding a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, looking out at the water. She didn't look at him immediately. She looked at the harbor, and for a moment they were just two people standing at the edge of a party with the same expression, wanting to be somewhere else, finding the water more honest than the conversation. Then she said, "You're Ethan Callaway." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but in that direction. "Don't ma'am me. You're 2 years older than I am. Force of habit." "Which supervisor?" "Marcus Webb." She nodded, still looking at the water. "He says you're the best rigger on the yard, that you could spot a structural problem with a hull from 40 feet away." "Marcus is generous." "He's not. Actually, I've known him for 6 years. He doesn't do generous. He does accurate. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were darker than he'd expected up close, and very direct. He also said, "You don't talk much." "I'm talking now." "You are." A pause. "Do you like it here?" "The work." He considered the question properly, which he suspected she could tell. "Yes, most days." "What about the other days?" "Those too, differently." She studied him for a moment with an expression he couldn't categorize. Not the assessment of an employer sizing up an employee, something less strategic than that, more genuinely curious, like someone who had been handed an unexpected piece of information and was trying to work out what to do with it. "You were a yacht designer," she said. The shift in conversation was so abrupt that for a second he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "Excuse me?" "Before. I looked at your personnel file." She didn't apologize for it, which he found he respected despite everything. "You have a naval architecture degree from Georgia Tech. You worked for Meridian Design Group in Savannah for 3 years. You were apparently being considered for a senior design position when you left." The glass in his hand was suddenly something to focus on. "That's accurate." "You left to care for your wife." The word hit the way it always did. Not sharp anymore, more like pressure, like weather. "Yes." "I'm sorry. It was 4 years ago." "That doesn't change whether I should be sorry." He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was careful in a different way than he'd seen from people expressing condolences. Not the careful of someone worried about saying the wrong thing, but the careful of someone who understood that some things didn't have the right things to say. "No," he said. "I guess it doesn't." A silence settled between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. That was the surprising part. It was the kind of silence that happens between people who are, for whatever reason, not performing for each other. Out on the water, the running lights of a container ship moved slowly through the dark. The jazz quartet was playing something he almost recognized. Behind them, the party continued in its own ecosystem, glasses touching, voices layering over each other, the particular sound of professional sociability. "I should go back," she said, but didn't move. "Probably," he agreed. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, almost to herself, "My father started this company with 2 dry docks and a loan he spent 12 years paying back. He always said the men who actually worked the boats were worth 10 of any suit in the boardroom." She paused. "I've been wondering lately whether I'm doing right by that." Ethan didn't know what to do with that kind of honesty from the person who signed the paychecks. He turned it over in his head. He thought about the correct professional response. He thought about Marcus, and about Langford's group near the bar, and about the way she'd looked at the yard when she'd first come outside. "The fact that you're wondering," he said, "probably means something." She looked at him again. "Does it?" People who aren't doing right by something usually don't ask. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, more the shape a smile makes before it decides whether to show up. That's either reassuring or terrible logic. Could be both. This time the smile made it. Small, slightly crooked, real. And then, this was the part he would turn over in his mind later, lying awake in his quiet house, listening to Lily breathe through the baby monitor. He still kept running out of habit. He said something he hadn't planned to say. It came out of somewhere he hadn't been monitoring, some unguarded place that the evening and the water and the way she'd talked to him had apparently gotten to. "Any man would count himself lucky," he said, "to have someone like you in his corner." He heard the words after they were already out. He heard how they sounded. He felt the heat move up the back of his neck. But Victoria Sterling didn't look embarrassed or amused in a dismissive way, or the dozen other things a person might look when a dock worker says something unplanned and slightly too honest to their employer at a company event. She looked at him steadily, and something in her face went very quiet, and she said low enough that it was clearly not meant for anyone but him, "I wish that man could be you." The container ship moved on through the dark. The music played. The party talked to itself behind them. Ethan Calloway stood very still and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because sometimes silence is the only honest response to something that lands somewhere deep and permanent inside you and starts rearranging furniture. She set her untouched wine glass on the railing. Good night, Ethan. Good night. She walked back into the party. He watched her go. He watched her re-enter that world of suits and shareholder language with the smooth ease of someone who'd learned to move in two registers at once. And he thought about what she'd said, and he knew, with the same certainty he felt about the storm coming in, the same body knowledge, that something had just changed. He didn't know what it was going to cost him. He didn't know what it was going to require. He just knew the way you know weather. Something's coming. Batten down. He was home by 10:30. Mrs. Alcott, 64, sharp-tongued, endlessly kind in the way that people are when they've stopped worrying about whether kindness makes them look soft, had already gone back to her own house next door. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Lily asked for water twice and was asleep by 8:30. Your shirt looks good ironed. You should do it more often. EA. He stood in the kitchen for a minute, still wearing the shirt, reading the note. Then he went down the hall and pushed open Lily's door. She was on her back with one arm thrown over her head, and the stuffed rabbit, named Captain for reasons she had explained once and he'd immediately forgotten, tucked under her other arm. Her dark hair was everywhere, which was its natural state. She had her mother's mouth and his eyes, and a completely independent personality that belonged to neither of them. He stood in the doorway a long time. The thing about loss, the specific kind he carried, the kind that comes from watching someone you love spend 2 years diminishing and then being gone all at once, was that it didn't move to the past the way people seem to expect it to. It didn't stay in one place. It migrated. It turned up in quiet moments, in the space between putting Lily to bed and the house being too still, in the way certain songs worked on him, in the particular quality of October evenings that smelled like the ones before she got sick. Claire had been 28 when she died. He'd been 28 too. They'd been the same age, which had seemed funny once. She'd been born in February, and he'd been born in November, and they'd spent 1 month every year being technically different ages, and then stopped being anything at all. He pulled her door almost closed and went back to the kitchen and sat at the table and looked at nothing for a while. Then he picked up his phone and did what he sometimes did when his head was too loud. He opened a blank document and started sketching hull lines. Not on paper, just in the Notes app, in rough numbers, beam ratios, waterline calculations. It wasn't real work. It was just the way his brain settled, like how some people did crosswords. He'd been doing this for 4 years, drawing boats he wasn't designing, for water he wasn't sailing, in late-night kitchen light that was the wrong light for drawing anything. His phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. Heard you talk to Sterling. You all right? He stared at the message, typed back, fine. Why? Marcus. People noticed. Langford's assistant was watching. Ethan. We had a 3-minute conversation. Marcus. This place runs on 3-minute conversations, man. Be careful. He set the phone down, looked at the hull numbers he'd been sketching. Outside, the first rain began. Not the storm, not yet, just the advance party. Light and exploratory, tapping at the windows. He thought about what she'd said. I wish that man could be you. He thought about Lily asleep down the hall, and the double-knotted lines on the portside cleats, and the design division he'd walked away from when Claire's diagnosis had made everything else seem like noise, and the fact that he hadn't told anyone in 11 months about the conversation he'd had with Richard Sterling 2 weeks before the old man died. The rain tapped at the windows. Ethan Calloway sat at his kitchen table with his borrowed shirt still on and his untouched drink still half full somewhere back at the party, and he thought about all of it for a long time. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Sleep didn't come for a while. The morning after this gala, the yard was quiet in the particular way it was quiet after a late event. Equipment where it belonged, chairs being broken down by the overnight cleaning crew, the white tablecloths gone, and the string lights being coiled up by 2 guys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Ethan was at work at 6, which was when he was always at work. He checked the lines on the smaller vessels. The knots had held, the storm had been lighter than the sky had promised, and then went through the standard morning inspection of Dry Dock 2, where a 40-foot sloop was in the middle of a hull restoration. He had been working for about an hour when he became aware that someone had come into the dry dock and was standing above him on the dock edge, watching. He looked up. Victoria Sterling was standing on the dock in work clothes, Not the dress from last night, but actual worn jeans and a company logo windbreaker, with a coffee cup in one hand and her hair down. She looked rested in the way that people who don't sleep look rested, functional, on. She was looking at the sloop's hull with the kind of attention that meant she was actually seeing it, not just performing interest. "You changed the joint compound on the port keel," she said. He straightened up slowly. "You know the spec." "My father took me through every vessel in this yard when I was 12. I know every spec." She looked at him. "The original compound was rated for 40-knot shear. What you've put in is rated for 60. The original wasn't going to hold." "How did you know?" "There was a stress pattern in the fiberglass around the joint. Hairline. You'd only see it if you were looking from below, which nobody had done recently because the last inspection was done from deck level." He paused. "I wrote it up in the maintenance report 3 weeks ago. I saw it this morning. That's why I'm here." He waited. She looked at the hull a moment longer, then back at him. "The original estimate for this restoration was $80,000. Your fix adds about $12,000 to that. The project manager signed off on keeping the original spec. The project manager doesn't come down here." "No." A pause. "You're telling me that if you hadn't changed it, the joint would have failed?" "Probably not right away. 2, 3 years, depending on conditions. Heavy weather, definitely sooner. And the project manager would have passed inspection." "Probably." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the hull with an expression he was starting to recognize. That same quality of attention she'd had at the water's edge. Something that was both sharp and weighted. "The project manager is going to be unhappy about the cost overrun," she said. "I know. I'm going to approve it anyway." "I know." Something moved across her face at that. "You know. You came down here yourself. If you were going to make me change it back, you'd have sent someone." She studied him for a moment. Then she said, "My father used to say that the men who actually see the problem are worth 10 of the ones who sign the paperwork." He recognized the echo of what she'd said last night. "You mentioned that." "I know I did." She took a sip of her coffee. "I'm trying to figure out if I believe it as readily as he did." "And?" "I'm still deciding." But the way she said it didn't sound undecided. She looked at the joint compound one more time, then looked at him. "Thank you for the report, and for not waiting for approval on something that needed to be done." "Yes." He caught himself before the ma'am got out. She noticed, the almost smile again. "Better." She turned and walked back along the dock edge and out of the dry dock, and he watched her go, and he thought about what Marcus had said. Langford's assistant was watching. He picked up his work light and got back to work. Marcus found him at lunch. They ate the way they usually ate, outside on the bench near the fabrication building, with the kind of food that didn't require a plate. Marcus had a sandwich that was mostly mustard and a bag of chips. Ethan had leftover pasta from the night before in a container that Mrs. Alcott had packed, which he was not going to mention because Marcus would never stop talking about it. "She came to the dry dock," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "For about 10 minutes. She does that, comes down early before the floor managers get in. Her dad did it too." He ate a chip. "What'd she want?" "The keel joint on the Whitfield restoration." Marcus made a sound of understanding. "Chang filed a complaint about the cost overrun." "I figured he would." "You're not worried?" Ethan ate his pasta. "About the complaint or about the joint?" "Either. The joint's solid, the complaint's going to go to Sterling, and she already came down and looked at the hull, so no." Marcus was quiet for a moment, eating his sandwich with the focused attention of a man working through something that had nothing to do with the food. Ethan had known Marcus Webb for 3 years, long enough to recognize when he was building toward a question he wasn't sure he should ask. "Just say it," Ethan said. Marcus sighed. "People are talking about last night. I had a conversation. For 12 minutes. I know because Patterson timed it because Patterson is like that." He wadded up his napkin. "Langford's people are making it into something." "Making what into something?" "You know what." Marcus looked at him directly. "There's something there, Ethan. I'm not blind. I've known you 3 years, and I've never seen you talk to anyone at a party for 12 minutes. It was 3 minutes. Patterson says Patterson should get a better hobby." "Ethan." Ethan looked out at the water. The morning's light rain had moved off, and the afternoon was coming in clear and sharp, the harbor going silver blue under a sky that had decided to be honest about itself after yesterday's evasion. "It's nothing," he said. "Okay. I mean it. I hear you." A pause. "Just be careful. Not because of anything you've done. Because Langford's been looking for something to use against her, and CEO gets distracted by a dock worker is exactly the kind of narrative he'd find useful." Ethan said nothing. "She's fighting for this company," Marcus said. "She's been fighting for it since her dad died. These guys on the board, they smell blood. They want to sell it off in pieces, take the payout, and walk. She's the only thing standing between them and that." "I know." "Then you know that anything that makes her look compromised helps them." Ethan folded the lid back on his food container. The harbor moved quietly in the afternoon light. Somewhere in the fabrication building, something was being cut, the high whine of a saw drifting out. He thought about her standing at the dry dock edge this morning, the way she'd named the original spec without looking at a document, the way she'd said, "I'm going to approve it anyway," with a certainty that had nothing performative about it. He thought about Langford's silver hair and the angle of that glance toward the main building. "I hear you," he said. Marcus nodded, satisfied with that, and finished his sandwich. The afternoon went quiet, except for the saw. Yeah. 3 days later, Ethan picked Lily up from school. He did this every day he wasn't on late shift, which was most days. He waited outside the chain-link fence with the other parents, or the other parent, singular, most days, which was a Mrs. Dominguez whose husband traveled for work and who had stopped making eye contact with Ethan several months back after a miscommunication about a school bake sale that he wasn't going to think about right now. Lily came out of the building in the wave of second graders, with the rabbit tucked under one arm, even though Ethan had told her 3 times that Captain was a home stuffed animal, not a school stuffed animal, and she appeared to have made a considered decision to ignore this policy entirely. She was carrying a piece of paper. She found him immediately. She always found him immediately, with the unerring radar of a small person who knows exactly who they're looking for, and marched over and shoved the paper at him. "We're supposed to draw something that's important to us," she said. "I drew a boat." He looked at the drawing. It was a very earnest boat, a lot of blue water, what appeared to be a sail that was also possibly a triangle that had gotten confused, and a figure on the deck that had 2 eyes and extremely optimistic hair. "Who's this?" he asked. "That's you," she said, with the exasperated patience of someone explaining something that should be obvious. "I'm on the boat." "It's your boat, the one you're going to design someday." He looked up. She was looking at him with her mother's steady gaze, complete certainty, no hedging. "Where'd you get that idea?" he asked carefully. "Mrs. Alcott said you used to draw boats. She said you were really good. She said you stopped because of—" She paused, with the particular delicacy of a 7-year-old who has been told certain things are complicated. "She said stuff happened, but she said you still do it sometimes." He folded the drawing carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. "I'm not a boat designer anymore, Bug," he said. "I work at the shipyard." "That's where boats are," she pointed out. "Yes. So you could still." He took her hand and they started toward the car. She fell into step beside him with the easy, trusting weight of a small person who is absolutely confident in where she's going. "Maybe someday," he said. "Okay," she said, in the tone that meant, "I'm filing this. It's not over." She didn't say anything else about it. She talked about a girl named Priya who had brought her hamster to school in violation of the no pets rule, and everyone had crowded around it, and the hamster had been both extremely soft and extremely panicked. And Mrs. Alcott had made grilled cheese. And could they have grilled cheese tonight? And also there was a permission slip in her backpack for a field trip that she'd sat on at some point and was slightly wrinkled, but the information was still readable. Ethan listened to all of it and drove them home and made grilled cheese. He put the drawing on the refrigerator. Later, after Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table again. He opened the Notes app on his phone. He looked at the whole numbers he'd sketched 3 nights ago. He thought about what Lily had said. That's where boats are. So you could still. The logic of someone who hadn't yet learned to see obstacles between wanting something and doing it. He sat with that for a while. Then he closed the Notes app, and went to bed. Yeah, he saw Victoria Sterling twice more that week. Once at a distance, she was crossing the main yard with two men he didn't recognize, one carrying a laptop, both in suits that suggested finance rather than maritime. And she was talking to them with the kind of focused economy that meant she was managing a conversation rather than having one. Once up close. He was at the supply locker near the end of Building 3 on Thursday afternoon, looking for a specific gauge of stainless steel cable that he was fairly sure someone had misfiled. The supply locker was a narrow, poorly lit space behind a metal door, and it smelled like machine oil and old rope, and it was the kind of place that management generally didn't go. He heard footsteps, looked up, and she was standing in the doorway. She looked slightly surprised to find anyone there. She was carrying a folder, and her hair was down again, and she looked like someone who had been in back-to-back meetings since before 8 a.m. and was using a trip to the supply locker as a reason to breathe. "Sorry," she said. "I wasn't expecting—" "I'm looking for something," he said, which was obvious and slightly unnecessary. "So am I." She held up the folder. "My father kept a set of the original structural plans for Building 3 in a file box that should theoretically be on a shelf in here somewhere, and 3 people have told me they've seen it recently, and 1 person has told me it doesn't exist, and I am finding out which." "Bottom shelf," Ethan said. "Far left, behind the safety harness inventory." She stared at him. "It's a gray metal file box," he said. "Water damaged on one corner. I moved it to get to the harnesses about 2 months ago. I put it back." She went to the bottom shelf. She moved the harnesses. She found the gray metal box. She turned and looked at him with an expression that he couldn't interpret except that it seemed to contain several different things happening at once. "How do you—" She shook her head. "How do you know where everything in this building is?" "I pay attention." "Apparently." She set the box on the shelf at eye level and opened it. He watched her go through the contents, careful, quick, clearly knowing what she was looking for. She found it within about 30 seconds, a set of large format blueprints in a protective sleeve. She held them for a moment without opening them. "These are from 1987, she said. "My father drew them himself. He wasn't formally trained. He just taught himself. He used to sit at the kitchen table after dinner and draw." She stopped. "Sorry, you don't need—" "It's fine." She glanced at him. "Do you still design? Outside work, I mean." He thought about the Notes app, the hall numbers, the kitchen table at midnight. "Not formally. But sometimes," he said, "it's a habit, more than anything." She looked at the blueprints in her hand. "My father had a design division, yacht design mostly, custom work. It was the part of the company he was proudest of." A pause. "Langford shut it down 2 years after Dad died. Cut costs," he said. "Made sense on paper." "Did it make sense off paper?" She looked at him again with that expression that meant she was recalibrating something. "No. It was the part of the company that made us different from every other shipyard on the coast." She put the blueprints under her arm. "I've been thinking about reopening it." He said nothing. "Everyone I've talked to says it's not the right time. Financial exposure, limited market, wrong priority." She moved toward the door. "They might be right. Or they might be telling you what's safe to say," Ethan said before he could stop himself. She paused in the doorway, looked back. He held his ground. "It's harder to tell the difference when you're the one who has to make the call." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her face did the complicated thing it sometimes did. The grief and the sharpness together, the thing he couldn't name. "I know," she said quietly. She left. Ethan stood in the supply locker for another minute, found the cable he'd originally come for, and went back to work. He thought about the blueprints she'd been holding, the ones her father had drawn at a kitchen table. He thought about his Notes app. He thought about Lily's drawing on the refrigerator, the boat, the optimistic sails, the figure on the deck with the extremely confident hair. "That's you. It's your boat, the one you're going to design someday." The supply locker door swung shut behind him. The harbor moved in its harbor way, indifferent and old and honest. And somewhere in the yard, in a gray metal file box on a bottom shelf behind the safety harnesses, 37 years of carefully folded blueprints sat in their protective sleeve, waiting to be used or not, waiting for someone to decide what things were worth holding on to and what things were worth building again. The October sky pressed down on Charleston. The storm was still coming. The drawing stayed on the refrigerator. Ethan noticed it every morning. First thing, when he came into the kitchen, still half asleep to start the coffee, the drawing would be there with its enthusiastic sails and its confident stick figure standing on a deck that was more suggestion than structure. Lily had added to it at some point without telling him. She'd drawn a smaller figure next to the tall one. It took him a moment to understand that the smaller figure was her. He didn't say anything about it. He just made the coffee and made her breakfast and drove her to school. And the drawing stayed where it was. The week after the gala moved the way weeks do when you're working hard enough to not have to think too much. Early starts, long afternoons, the physical satisfaction of problems that have correct answers. The Whitfield restoration was progressing. The keel joint held under preliminary stress testing, which vindicated the cost overrun in a way that made the paperwork feel almost worth it. Chang, the project manager, had stopped making eye contact with Ethan in the break room, which was fine. Eye contact wasn't required for the work. What was harder to manage was the thing that had no correct answer and no stress test. He caught himself thinking about her at wrong moments. Not in a way he could fully examine or name, more like peripheral awareness, the way you're conscious of a door that's been left slightly open in a room you're not in. He'd be checking a weld seam and his mind would produce, without permission, the image of her standing in the supply locker doorway holding her father's blueprints with that complicated expression. He'd be helping Lily with her spelling homework and find himself remembering the precise quality of her voice when she'd said, "I wish that man could be you." The way it had been almost reluctant, like the sentence had gotten out before she'd decided to let it. He didn't do anything about it. He didn't know what doing something would even look like. He went to work and picked up Lily and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table at night with whole numbers in his notes app, and he held the whole thing at arm's length and told himself that was the correct distance. Marcus noticed, because Marcus always noticed. "You're distracted," Marcus said one morning, not accusatory, just factual. "I'm working." "You checked that fitting 3 times. "It's a complicated fitting." Marcus said nothing. He had the patience of a man who had raised 4 kids and knew that waiting was usually more effective than pushing. He picked up his clipboard and made a note and didn't press it, and Ethan appreciated that in the way you appreciate someone who understands the exact size of the space you need. But the distraction was real. He knew it. He just didn't know what to do with it except keep working and wait for it to settle. It didn't settle. What happened instead was that he started learning things about her that he hadn't known, and each thing landed differently than the last. And together they built a picture that was harder to hold at arm's length than a single conversation at a harbor edge. It started with Marcus, who had worked at Sterling Maritime for 11 years and had known Richard Sterling personally, and talked about him the way men talk about someone they genuinely respected. Not with hero worship, but with the honest acknowledgement that some people are simply better at being human than others. "He used to walk the whole yard every Saturday morning," Marcus said one afternoon. They were eating lunch in the usual spot, the bench near fabrication, the harbor doing its harbor thing in the middle distance. 8 a.m., rain or shine, just walked it, talked to whoever was around, not management stuff, just talking, asking about people's families, how the work was going, what was giving them trouble. A pause. "She does it too. Different day, usually earlier, but she does it." "I know," Ethan said. "I've seen her." "Did you know she learned to read ship blueprints when she was 9? He taught her. She was doing hull calculations by 12. Marcus unwrapped his sandwich. When he got sick, she was in her first year at Wharton. She came home. He told her to go back. She told him no. She finished the degree from here, remote, while managing the company's legal restructuring and his medical care simultaneously. Ethan looked at the harbor. "She was 25, Marcus said. "I didn't know that." "Most people don't. She doesn't talk about it." He ate his sandwich. The board didn't want her. When Richard died, Langford was already trying to install an outside CEO. He had someone lined up. She showed up to the board meeting with a 30-page operational plan, 2 months of financial projections, and the legal documentation confirming her controlling shares. She was wearing her father's watch. He paused. Langford hasn't forgiven her for it. Ethan sat with that for a while. He thought about her at 25, younger than he'd been when Claire got sick, younger than he'd been when he'd had to learn to do everything alone, doing all of that simultaneously. He thought about the board meeting, the 30 pages, the watch, the particular kind of stubbornness it took to walk into a room of people who didn't want you there and make them deal with you anyway. He recognized something in it. Not the same thing he'd lived through. Her situation and his were built from different materials, but the same underlying structure. The way loss changes the shape of a person, not by breaking them, but by burning away whatever wasn't essential, and what's left is either nothing or something very hard and very specific. He thought about this without saying any of it out loud. Marcus finished his sandwich and said nothing else about it. But the next few weeks kept adding layers he hadn't expected. He learned from Patterson of all people. Patterson, who timed conversations and had the information-gathering instincts of a person with too much time and not enough to aim it at, that Victoria Sterling had rejected 3 acquisition offers in the past 18 months. Real money. Each one would have made her personally wealthy beyond any practical need and ended her daily responsibility for 600 employees and a company that was fighting for its margin in an industry that didn't reward sentiment. She'd said no to all 3. He learned from the HR coordinator who processed the maintenance reports and occasionally talked while she did it that Sterling Maritime's employee health plan had been expanded twice in the past 2 years. Better coverage, lower premiums, at a point when the financials were tight enough that the board had recommended cutting it. She paid for part of it out of operating reserves, the HR coordinator said, with the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing information they found remarkable. Langford was furious, said it was irresponsible allocation. She said if you can't pay for your people's health, you shouldn't be in business. He learned from a retired machinist named Dell, who came around sometimes to help on specialized jobs, and had known Richard Sterling since the beginning, that Ethan's own hire had not been entirely routine. He was replacing a drive shaft component on a small workboat when Dell said it, offhandedly, the way old men sometimes drop significant things into ordinary conversation. "You know she read your application herself," Dell said. Ethan looked up. "What?" "Sterling. When you applied 3 years ago. Most hires at your level, the floor manager handles it, but she pulled yours. Read it herself." "Why?" Dell shrugged with the elaborate casualness of someone who wasn't sure how much to say. "You had a degree that most riggers don't have, and your references from Meridian, your design work, she'd apparently heard of some of it. Your senior project at Georgia Tech got written up somewhere, I don't remember where." He picked up a wrench. "She approved the hire personally, and she asked Marcus to keep an eye on you, not in a surveillance way. More like, keep him engaged." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He worked the drive shaft with his hands on automatic, not thinking about the component. Thinking about 3 years ago, when he'd applied for a rigger position at Sterling Maritime, because it was the closest thing to boats he could do while staying in Charleston, near Lily's school, near Mrs. Alcott, near the geography of a life that had been reduced and then rebuilt at smaller scale. He thought it had been a routine hire. "She knew about my design work," he said. It wasn't a question. "Apparently," Dell turned the wrench. "She knew who you were before you walked in the door." Ethan thought about the gala. About her saying, "You were a yacht designer." About the matter-of-fact way she'd known his history, the degree, Meridian, the design position. He'd assumed it was the personnel file. Standard employer knowledge. Maybe it was. Maybe Dell was reading significance into something administrative, but he thought about her standing at the dry dock edge in the early morning. He thought about the supply locker. He thought about, "I wish that man could be you," and the way she'd said it like it had been waiting a while. He got back to work and didn't say anything. That night, after Lily was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table longer than usual. He didn't open the Notes app. He just sat with the accumulation of what he'd learned and tried to find the correct frame for it, and kept finding that the frames he tried didn't quite fit. She'd known who he was. She'd approved his hire personally. She'd told her foreman to keep him engaged. She'd come to the dry dock herself, and to the supply locker, and she'd talk to him. Really talk to him. Not the way a CEO talks to a dock worker, but the way someone talks to a person they've been waiting to say things to. He was doing the math in his head, and the math kept coming out somewhere that scared him a little. Not because of her, because of himself. Because he could feel the distance he'd maintained for 4 years. The careful, necessary distance from anything that asked too much of him emotionally. Starting to develop weak points, and the sensation was not entirely unwelcome. And that was the part that was frightening. He was not ready. He knew he was not ready. The problem was that readiness had apparently not been consulted. He went to bed. He stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes. Then he slept. The next morning, Lily asked him if he was okay. She asked it at breakfast over cereal with the directness of a 7-year-old who had decided that circling around something was for people who didn't have better things to do. "I'm fine," he said. "You're doing the face," she said. "What face?" "The one where you're thinking about something and you think you're not making a face, but you're making a face." He looked at her. She looked back with complete equanimity, Captain the Rabbit propped against her cereal bowl. "I'm fine, Bug," he said. "Okay." She ate her cereal. Then, "Mrs. Alcott says sometimes people seem fine and they're not fine, and the best thing is to talk to someone." "Mrs. Alcott talks too much." "She says that too," Lily said agreeably. He drove her to school, and she got out of the car and turned back and waved once. That particular wave, the whole-arm version she'd done since she was 4. And he watched her go through the gate and thought about how much of him she carried without knowing it, how much of both of them she was, and how that was, depending on the day, the most sustaining thing in his life or the most exposing. He drove to the yard. The day was unremarkable except for the conversation that happened at 4 in the afternoon when he was cleaning up after a welding inspection, and one of the administrative assistants from the main building came down with a message. The message was handwritten on a note card with the sterling maritime letterhead, and it said, "If you have time Friday afternoon, I'd like to talk. V.S." He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his back pocket and finished cleaning up, and drove home and made dinner and helped Lily with a geography worksheet about South American capitals, and didn't think about the note card, or tried not to. He sent back a message through the same administrative assistant. Friday works. Friday afternoon arrived with the particular quality of late October light in Charleston, golden and cool, the harbor going copper green, the shadows coming in long and honest. He cleaned up after his shift and went to the main building and found the office on the 3rd floor that had been Richard Sterling's and was now his daughter's. The administrative assistant, a young woman named Diane, who had the organizational ferocity of someone who had decided that her boss was not going to be eaten alive by the industry if she had anything to say about it, waved him through with the expression of someone who had been told to expect him. He knocked on the open door. Victoria looked up from her desk. The office looked like someone had inherited it and not entirely moved in. Her father's things still occupied the bookshelves, the framed maritime charts on the walls, a model of the company's first dry dock, and a glass case by the window. Her own presence in the room was layered over his carefully, like she didn't want to erase what he'd left. There were legal pads everywhere, 2 laptops, a coffee cup that had been full recently and wasn't anymore. She looked tired, not the functional tired from the day after the gala. This was older, the kind that lives behind the eyes and doesn't respond to sleep. "Close the door," she said. He did. He sat in the chair across from her desk, which felt strange, the way it feels strange to be in a room where the furniture is arranged for a power dynamic you're not sure applies. "You've heard the rumors," she said. Not a question. "Some." "Tell me what you've heard." He considered the value of being indirect and decided against it. That Langford has been in talks with outside investors, that there's a push to sell the company, that the votes are close. She nodded slowly. The vote is closer than close. At the next board meeting, there's going to be a formal motion, acquisition by Hargrove Capital. They buy legacy maritime businesses, take them apart, rebrand the profitable components. 600 jobs. She paused. They've offered enough money that 2 of our longest tenured board members are seriously considering it. Ethan said nothing. "I need to give them a reason to vote against it," she said. "Not just emotionally, economically, a real vision for what this company becomes." "The design division," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes." "You want to reopen it?" "I want to present a plan to reopen it at the board meeting. A real plan, not a concept. Something with numbers, timelines, projected revenue, market analysis." She held his gaze. "I looked at everything my father left, the client relationships, the equipment inventory, the talent pipeline that existed before Langford shut it down. There's more there than I expected." A pause. But I need someone who understands the technical side. Someone who can look at the design specifications and tell me what's viable and what isn't. Someone who knows the market. He understood what she was asking. He felt it land in his chest somewhere deep and not entirely comfortable. "You're asking me to help you build the pitch," he said. "I'm asking if you're willing to. As a rigger. As someone who is actually qualified for this. Your Georgia Tech project, the low draft performance hall, I had someone pull the paper. It was cited in 2 industry publications. You know what you're doing, Ethan. You've been doing it in a notes app on your phone instead of in a design room, and I don't know entirely why, but I know you haven't stopped thinking about it." The notes app. He felt something shift in his face that he couldn't fully control. "You can't know about the notes app," he said. "I don't, not specifically. I know the type." Something in her expression went careful. "I knew someone who never stopped doing the thing they loved, even when life made it impossible to do it properly. It just goes underground. It finds whatever form it can." She looked at her desk for a moment. "That's how I know." He sat with that. He thought about the kitchen table, the midnight hull calculations. 4 years of loving something in secret because openly loving it meant admitting you still wanted a life that looked different from the one you had. "I have a daughter," he said. "I can't take on something that eats my evenings. Whatever hours work for you. Weekends, early mornings, whatever you can manage. This doesn't have to be formal until we know if it's viable." She looked at him directly. "I'm not asking you to rearrange your life. I'm asking you to use what you already know." He was quiet for a long moment. The copper-green harbor moved outside the window. Somewhere below, the yard was going through its end-of-shift sounds. Equipment powering down, voices, the particular acoustic signature of 600 people wrapping up a day's work. "Can I see what you have?" he said. "The design division documentation, the equipment inventory, what your father left." She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a file box. The same gray metal box from the supply locker, the water-damaged corner. She set it on the desk between them. "It's all in there," she said, "and I have more in storage." He reached out and opened the box. The blueprints on top were the ones she'd found. Her father's hand-drawn designs from 1987, slightly faded, the lines precise in the way that someone's lines get precise when they've taught themselves rather than been taught, when every stroke is deliberate because nothing is habitual. Richard Sterling had drawn these at a kitchen table. You could feel it in them. The same domestic intimacy that Ethan's midnight calculations had. He turned them carefully. He looked at the hull ratios, the beam specifications, the keel geometry. He found the problems, 3 of them, the ones that would have shown up under load. He also found the things that were genuinely good, the water entry angle, the stern volume distribution, a particular solution for cockpit drainage that he'd seen done badly 100 times, and Richard had gotten right without apparently knowing he'd done anything unusual. He sat there for a while, turning pages, not speaking. Victoria didn't say anything. She let him look. Finally, he said, "Your father had good instincts." He had excellent instincts," she said quietly. "He just didn't have the training to know which ones to trust." "This drainage solution," he pointed. "This is better than what Meridian was doing when I was there. Did he ever know that?" She shook her head. "I don't think anyone ever told him." Ethan sat back. He looked at the blueprint. He thought about Richard Sterling at a kitchen table, drawing boats at night, not knowing that what he'd worked out on his own was better than what the professionals down the coast were doing. "Okay," he said. Victoria looked at him. "Okay. I'll help you build it. Evenings and weekends. I want to see the equipment inventory and the client list and whatever market analysis you have." He paused. "And I want it understood that this doesn't change my position on the yard. I'm still a rigger. This is parallel." "Understood. If this goes somewhere, if the board approves the division and you need someone to actually run it, that's a different conversation." "Yes," she said. "It is." He nodded. He closed the file box with the careful attention of someone handling something that matters. He stood up. "I'll start this weekend," he said. "I'll have the rest of the files sent to your workstation." He moved toward the door. He had his hand on the frame when she said, "Ethan." He turned. She was looking at him with the expression she'd had at the harbor edge, the one he couldn't name, the complicated one with the grief and the sharpness and the something else underneath. Thank you, she said, not with the professional formality she used with her board or her managers. With the directness she'd used from the beginning, the voice that didn't perform. He held her gaze for a moment. He thought about what Marcus had said. She's been fighting for this company since her father died. And he thought about the 30 pages she'd brought to the board meeting at 25 and the watch. Don't thank me yet, he said. We don't know if it's viable. I know, she said. But still. He left. He took the stairs down instead of the elevator, which was habit, and walked out through the main yard in the copper-green late afternoon light, and Marcus was at the far end of the dock doing something with a line and looked up when Ethan walked past. Marcus read his face in the way he had. You okay? He said. Yeah. What happened? Nothing. Maintenance conversation? He kept walking, then he stopped and turned back. You know she's planning to reopen the design division? Marcus was quiet for a second. I've heard things. She's putting together a pitch for the board meeting. Another pause. You involved in that? Ethan looked at him. Marcus nodded slowly, with an expression that contained several things. Respect, concern, something that might have been relief. Okay, he said. Okay. Don't make it something. I'm not. Good. He drove to pick up Lily. She came out of school with the rabbit and a painting she'd done in art class. A harbor scene, blue water, what appeared to be a slightly lopsided but enthusiastically colored sunset. She got in the car and examined her painting critically. I couldn't get the orange right, she said. It looks right to me. You always say that. Because it always looks right. She considered this with the skepticism of a 7-year-old who suspected she was being managed. Mrs. Hewitt says orange is the hardest color to mix. Mrs. Hewitt's probably right. She said to keep trying and it gets easier. Lily held the painting up against the car window, examining it against the actual sky. I'm going to keep trying. Yeah, Ethan said. He looked at the harbor through the windshield. The same copper-green water, the same late light. The cranes going dark against the orange sky that was also, he thought, slightly harder to get right than it looked. Me too, Bug, he said. Me too. He drove them home. That evening, after dinner and after the bath battle, and after 2 chapters of the chapter book they were working through together, after Captain was properly positioned and the lamp was off, and Lily was in that warm, boneless state that comes right before sleep, she said, without opening her eyes. Dad, are you happy? He was sitting on the edge of her bed. He thought about the question the way she'd asked it, not worried, not leading, just genuinely curious, the way she was about most things. Some days more than others, he said. That's normal, she said. Mrs. Alcott says that's how it works. Mrs. Alcott is a wise woman. She says you were happy before. Different kind of happy. A pause. She says you can be again. He sat with that for a moment. The house was quiet. Outside, the harbor was making its harbor sounds, low and constant and honest. She might be right, he said. Lily was already most of the way asleep. Good, she said faintly. I think so too. He sat there a little longer after she was fully under. Then he went back to the kitchen and opened his laptop for the first time in months. The actual laptop, not just the phone, and opened the design software he'd last used 4 years ago and sat looking at the blank workspace. His hands were the wrong kind of still, the kind of still that comes before something. He put his hands on the keys. He started working. He worked for 3 hours without looking up, and when he finally stopped, it was past midnight and his coffee was cold, and he had the beginning, rough, full of problems, needing everything, of something that hadn't existed that morning. A hull design. His own. The first real one in 4 years. It wasn't good yet. It needed weeks of work. It had at least 6 structural issues he could already identify, and probably more he couldn't see yet. But it existed. He saved the file. He closed the laptop. He stood up and stretched, and his back complained about 3 hours of hunching over a keyboard in a kitchen chair, and he didn't care at all. He looked at the refrigerator. Lily's drawing was still there. The boat, the sails, the 2 figures on deck. He stood there for a long time in the quiet kitchen. Then he turned off the light and went to bed, and this time sleep came quickly and without argument. Outside, the harbor moved under the October stars. The cranes stood dark against the sky. The boats were tied and riding easy, the knots holding. And in a gray metal file box on a desk on the third floor of a building that a man had built from 2 dry docks and a 12-year loan, his daughter's handwritten designs were laid out next to a blank legal pad where someone had already started making notes in the margins. Precise, technical, the shorthand of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time and had finally found the reason to say it out loud. The weekends became a different kind of time. Ethan had spent 3 years organizing his life around 2 modes: work and Lily. The work was physical and honest and asked only that he show up and pay attention. Lily asked more than that, and he gave it willingly. And between those 2 things there had been enough structure to hold a life together. Not a full life, but he knew the difference, had known it the way you know the difference between a patched hull and a sound one, but a functional one. A life that got through its days without falling apart. Now there was a third thing, and it was expanding in ways he hadn't anticipated. Saturday mornings, after he dropped Lily at Mrs. Alcott's, he drove to the main building and took the stairs to the 3rd floor and spread files across the conference table adjacent to Victoria's office. She was usually already there. She worked the way he'd come to expect. Focused, efficient, no small talk until she'd cleared whatever had been pressing on her since the day before. She'd made 2 pots of coffee by the time he arrived, which he'd learned meant she'd been there since before 6. They worked mostly in the kind of silence that meant the same thing from both of them. This matters, so let's not waste it. The design division files were more substantial than he'd expected. Richard Sterling had kept meticulous records of every project the division had completed: client contracts, design specifications, materials logs, correspondence. There were 42 completed projects over 18 years, ranging from a 22-foot day sailor to a 60-foot offshore racing yacht. The quality varied, which was honest and human, but the trajectory was clear. Richard had gotten better, project by project, in the patient, incremental way of someone who learned by doing rather than by training. What wasn't in the files was a vision for what the division could become. Richard had run it well, but he'd run it small and careful. He'd never pushed past a certain size, never positioned it against the larger design houses on the East Coast, never tried to be anything other than what it was. He was afraid of failing big, Victoria said one Saturday, looking at the revenue projections from the last 5 years the division had operated. He'd built everything from nothing, and he couldn't risk losing it, so he kept the division small enough that losing it wouldn't break the company. He was probably right to, Ethan said. The market was different 5 years ago. And now? He leaned back in his chair and thought about it honestly. He'd been reading the industry publications he'd stopped reading 4 years ago. He'd been running numbers on material costs, labor projections, competitive positioning. He'd been doing it the way you do something when you're trying to find reasons it won't work and keep finding the opposite instead. Custom performance yacht design is actually underserved right now on the East Coast, he said. The big houses in Newport and Annapolis are backlogged 18 months. Meridian lost 2 of their senior designers last year. I heard through a contact. There's a window. He paused. It won't stay open forever. Victoria looked at the revenue projections. Then she looked at him. How long? 2 years, maybe 3. After that, someone else will move into it. She nodded slowly. What would we need to open the division at a scale that could actually compete? 4 designers minimum. 2 experienced, 2 junior. Dedicated design space. The old division room on the 2nd floor needs structural upgrades, and the CAD systems are 6 years out of date. A business development person who actually knows the market. He looked at his notepad. And a lead designer who carries enough credibility that clients take the pitch seriously before they've seen the work. Someone with a name, she said. Someone with a record. A pause. Like a Georgia Tech hull design that got cited in 2 industry publications. He kept his eyes on the notepad. I told you, that was a student project. I had someone pull the citation context, she said, which he had not expected. The paper that cited it called your water entry angle solution genuinely novel. That's not language academic engineers use casually. He looked up. She was watching him steadily. Not pushing, exactly. More the way she approached everything, with that direct patience that didn't perform pressure but didn't retreat either. That was 11 years ago, he said. The physics hasn't changed. I'm a rigger. You're a rigger who's been designing boats in a notes app at midnight for 4 years. She held his gaze. The work you've done in the last 3 weeks, the preliminary specs for the 40-footer, I had one of my father's old contacts look at it without telling him who'd done it. He said it was the best hull geometry he'd seen in 5 years and wanted to know which design house it came from. The table between them was quiet. Outside, the harbor made its low sounds. A gull went past the window in a diagonal, purposeful, then gone. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Because I wanted you to get there yourself." She said it simply, without apology. "I was afraid if I pushed you toward it, you'd push back. And I needed you to want it, not feel obligated." He sat with that for a while. He looked at his hands on the table, the calluses, the scar from the winch cable, the hands that had been doing the wrong work for years without entirely stopping doing the right work. "I need to think about it," he said. "I know." He drove home that afternoon through the Charleston streets with the particular quality of attention that comes when your mind is working on something too large to hold all at once. He picked up Lily from Mrs. Alcott's, and she chattered about a bird she'd seen and a book Mrs. Alcott had read to her, and a complicated social situation involving Priya and the hamster's apparent sequel appearance at school. And he listened and responded in the right places, and underneath all of it, he was running calculations that had nothing to do with hull geometry. What it would mean to step back into that version of himself. What it would mean for Lily's schedule, her stability. What it would mean to want something for himself again, specifically and without qualification, after years of having need be the cleaner, simpler feeling. What it would mean to be in the same place and time close to Victoria Sterling. That last part he circled without landing on it. He wasn't ready to look at it directly. He made dinner. He read to Lily. He sat at the kitchen table after she was asleep and opened the whole design file and looked at the 40-footer's preliminary specs. And he thought about the old contact saying best hull geometry in 5 years. And he thought about his student project. And he thought about Richard Sterling drawing boats at a kitchen table and getting things right that the professionals down the coast were getting wrong. He thought about what it cost to stop doing the thing you were made to do. He already knew that answer. He'd been paying it for 4 years. He closed the laptop. He looked at Lily's drawing on the refrigerator, the 2 figures on the deck, the optimistic sails. "That's you. It's your boat, the one you're going to design someday." He went to bed. He didn't decide that night, but something in him had already decided, and he was just waiting to catch up to it. The week that followed was ordinary until Thursday, when it wasn't. The storm had been in the forecast since Tuesday, a late-season system building off the coast, the meteorologists hedging about its final track and intensity in the way that made experienced coastal workers skeptical of the hedging and attentive to the sky. Ethan had been watching it with the particular attention he gave to things that could damage what he was responsible for. Wednesday evening, he'd done an extra walk of the yard, checking lines, noting which boats needed additional fenders, flagging 2 items for Marcus. Marcus had filed the report and added 3 of his own and sent the maintenance crew over a title note to the harbor authority. And by Thursday morning, everyone in the yard who knew what they were doing was operating on the quiet assumption that it was going to be worse than the official forecast. It was. By 3 in the afternoon, the sky had the wrong color. Not the dramatic darkness of an obvious storm, but a flattened gray-green quality, like the light had been filtered through something unhealthy. The wind was coming in from the southeast in irregular gusts that the boats didn't like, pulling at their lines and knocking fenders against hulls in a rhythmic complaint. The harbor surface had gone choppy and dark. Marcus sent 2 crews to secondary tie-down positions. Ethan was already moving. He worked the smaller vessels first, the workboats and day sailors that had the least margin for error in surge conditions, double-tying their stern lines, repositioning fenders, checking cleats that he'd checked before and needed to check again. The wind made the work slower and more physical than it should have been, pushing back against every move, and the first rain came in sideways around 4:30, cold and hard, the kind that finds the gap between your jacket collar and your neck immediately. He was on the 3rd workboat when he heard someone come down the dock behind him and assumed it was Marcus. He looked up. Victoria Sterling was coming down the dock in a yellow rain jacket, the industrial kind, not the fashionable kind, and rubber boots, and she was moving with the careful speed of someone who'd learned to walk on wet dock surfaces. Her hair was plastered to her forehead. She was already soaked. He stared at her. Tell me what needs doing, she said over the wind. You shouldn't be out here. Tell me what needs doing, or I'll figure it out myself, and you'll spend time correcting me that you don't have. She looked down at the workboat, at the lines he'd been adjusting. What's left? He made a fast calculation. Far end of the main dock. 3 sailboats still on single stern lines. Go double. I'll do the cleats on this side. She nodded and went. No hesitation. He watched her for half a second. Because he was human, and the situation was unexpected, and her complete unself-consciousness about showing up and doing work was something that landed in him before he could manage it. And then he went back to his own work. The storm arrived properly around 6. Not a hurricane. Not that. But serious. A 40 knot sustained with gusts above 50, the harbor churning, waves breaking over the lower dock sections in bursts of gray-white water. The crew worked in clusters, shouting over the wind, the rain going sideways and then vertical and then sideways again. Equipment that hadn't been secured was getting punished. 2 fenders went into the water and had to be recovered before they got underneath hulls. Ethan moved from problem to problem with the focused triage of someone who'd been trained for this by years of experience and had the particular advantage of knowing this yard's specific vulnerabilities better than almost anyone. He knew which cleat had a loose bolt that had been on the maintenance list for 3 weeks. He knew which boat's keel stepped in a way that made it vulnerable to surge from the northeast. He knew where the secondary power junction was and why it mattered when the primary showed stress. He didn't think about anything except the work. At some point, in the specific chaos of the worst 2 hours, he and Victoria ended up working the same problem. A 30-foot sloop that had started working its bow line loose as the cleat pulled against wind load at an angle it wasn't rated for. The cleat needed a backing plate that wasn't there, which meant the solution was a different attachment point, which required 2 people to manage, one holding tension on the line, one repositioning the attachment. They didn't discuss it. She took the line and he found the attachment point, and they did it the way people do things when they've been paying attention to each other long enough to understand how the other one moves. The wind screamed over them. The rain came in hard. The sloop pushed at its lines like a living thing that had opinions about captivity. It took about 4 minutes. When the line was secure, she leaned back against the dock railing and caught her breath, and he was close enough to see the way her chest moved under the rain jacket, and close enough that when she turned her head to look at him, there was very little space between them. Her face was completely soaked. Her hair had abandoned any pretense of arrangement. She had a smear of something dark, grease maybe, or just the grime that comes off dock hardware in the rain, along her left cheekbone. She looked absolutely nothing like the CEO who had walked into her gala 3 weeks ago, and exactly like herself. "Is that the worst of it?" she said. "Should be." He looked at the sky over the harbor. The pressure felt different, still ugly, but the quality of the wind had shifted. "Another hour and it'll drop." She nodded. She didn't move away from the railing immediately. "You didn't have to come out here," he said. Not accusatory, just saying the fact. 600 people work here, she said. "This place is their livelihood. It's mine too, but..." She shook her head. "I can't sit in an office and watch. Most people in your position would." "I know." She looked at the harbor. "I'm aware that's not a compliment to most people in my position." He was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed at them both. The sloop held. "Your father used to do this too?" he asked. She looked at him. Something moved in her face. "He was out in a storm when I was 8, she said. "A bad one. I was terrified. My mother was furious. He came in at 2 in the morning, soaked through, and she said, 'Richard, you could have sent someone.' And he said, 'I know, but these are my boats.'" A pause. She stopped being furious about it after that. Ethan looked at the sloop. The line was holding clean and proper against the cleat. 4 minutes of good work. "These are your boats," he said. She looked at him again, and the expression on her face was the one he still couldn't name. The complicated one. The one that was too many things layered together to reduce. "Yeah," she said quietly. "They are." They went back to work. The storm wound down by 9. The yard was a mess. Equipment scattered, 2 dock sections with debris, 1 minor hull scrape on a workboat that had swung hard against its neighbor in the surge. But nothing catastrophic. The lines had held. The cleats had held. The 48 hours of preparation Marcus had quietly managed had done what preparation was supposed to do. The crew stood around the main dock in various stages of soaked exhaustion, doing the assessment that comes after, checking what held, noting what hadn't, the specific relief of a crisis that ended without a disaster. Someone had produced a case of beer from somewhere, which was technically against yard policy, and which Marcus was pointedly not noticing. Victoria stood with the crew. That was the part that Ethan watched with the careful attention he'd been giving her since the gala. She didn't stand apart. She stood in the middle of it, talking to people. Real conversations, not the executive mingling kind, the kind where you learn someone's name and remember it, where you ask about the specific problem they'd worked on and listen to the answer. She was accepting the beer someone handed her without ceremony and talking to a machinist named Rosario about the secondary power junction and whether the housing needed replacement. Patterson was there, which meant this would circulate. Langford's assistant had apparently left when the storm got serious, but Patterson went everywhere and remembered everything and operated as a kind of informal news service for the yard's entire social ecosystem. Ethan drank his beer and watched and didn't try to manage any of it. Marcus materialized beside him. Hell of a night. Yeah. She did well. Marcus didn't look at him when he said it, which was deliberate. Better than some of my regular crew. She grew up here. I know, still. He drank. Langford is going to hear about this. Ethan looked at him. She worked alongside hourly employees in a storm, Marcus said quietly. To some people, that looks admirable. To Langford, it looks like a CEO who's emotionally compromised, too attached to the operation to make rational business decisions. He'll use it. He'll use it how? Same way he uses everything, slow and patient and in the right ears at the right time. Marcus turned the beer bottle in his hands. The board meeting is 6 weeks out. He's going to spend those 6 weeks building a case that she's not fit to lead the company through a transition. She is absolutely fit. I know that. You know that. 600 people out here know that. He finally looked at Ethan. The 4 board members who are on the fence about the Hargrove offer don't come down to the yard. They see reports, and they hear what Langford tells them. A pause. Your plan, the design division pitch, it needs to be airtight, not just good. Airtight, because they are going to pick it apart, looking for reasons not to believe it. Ethan said nothing. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, Marcus said. No. I'm just saying, the stakes got higher tonight, not because of the storm, because of how she handled it. Ethan looked at Victoria, still talking to Rosario, gesturing at something along the dock edge, completely unconscious of being observed. The beer bottle in her hand, the rain-soaked jacket, the grease smear she hadn't noticed was still on her cheek. Something in him was loud and inconvenient. He looked away. I know, he said. The next morning came in cold and clean, the harbor washed honest by the storm, the sky gone that specific pale blue that only shows up after weather has been through, and stripped everything temporary away. The yard was already humming with the cleanup. Debris removal, the hull scrape assessment, power system checks, the organized aftermath of a crisis well managed. Ethan arrived at 6, which was when he arrived. He started on the debris assessment for Dock 3 and was 40 minutes into it when he became aware that he was being watched. Not Victoria this time. Victor Langford was standing at the top of the dock ramp in a suit that was wrong for the harbor in every way, with 2 men beside him who had the specific look of lawyers or financial consultants, men who carried information as a weapon and wore it in the set of their shoulders. He wasn't watching the cleanup. He was watching Ethan. When Ethan looked up and met his eyes, Langford didn't look away. He held the eye contact for a moment with the particular deliberateness of a man making a point without speaking it, and then he turned and said something to the man on his left, and they walked toward the main building. It was maybe 8 seconds. It carried the weight of something much longer. Marcus was beside Ethan a few minutes later. He'd seen it. Don't react, Marcus said quietly. I'm not reacting. Good. What was that? That was Victor Langford deciding whether you're a problem he needs to manage. Marcus looked at the clipboard in his hands rather than at Ethan. The gala, the storm, people talk. He's been connecting things. There's nothing to connect. Marcus said nothing. There isn't, Ethan said, and heard himself and knew how it sounded. and knew that knowing how it sounded was itself information about the state of things. Marcus said very carefully, "I believe you that nothing's happened. I do." A pause. "But something's happening, Ethan. You and I both know that. And Langford can read a situation. He does it for a living." Ethan looked at the harbor. The clean morning light on the water was doing something complicated to the colors, green and silver and one streak of orange near the horizon where the sun was still low. "The pitch is 3 weeks out," he said. "I need to finish it." "I know." Whatever Langford thinks or doesn't think doesn't change the work. "No," Marcus agreed. "It doesn't." But they both stood there a moment longer than they needed to, watching the water, because they both understood that the work and the rest of it were going to get harder to separate the closer it all got to the board meeting, and harder to separate meant harder to protect. 2 days later, Victoria called him into her office. She was standing when he came in, not at her desk, which he'd learned meant the conversation was going to be something she couldn't think through sitting still. She had a legal pad in one hand and a pen she kept clicking, which was the only tell he'd identified in her, the clicking pen, when she was working through something difficult. "Patterson made a report to Langford," she said. He'd expected it, but hearing it stated plainly still landed with weight. "When?" "2 days ago, the day after the storm." She looked at the legal pad. Langford's version of events. The CEO spent 12 minutes in private conversation with a dock worker at the company gala. Then the same dock worker was assigned a significant repair project over the objection of the assigned project manager. Then the CEO spent over 2 hours working alongside this specific employee during the storm. And then the same employee has been visiting the main building on weekends. She said it in the flat, factual way that someone recites a sequence of events that sounds different without context. "He's building a narrative," Ethan said. "He's building a narrative," she confirmed. "And the problem is that individually, none of those things are wrong. I can justify each one, but together, framed the way he'll frame them." She stopped clicking the pen. "He's going to argue that my judgment is compromised, that I have a personal interest that's affecting operational and financial decisions, that I'm not capable of leading the company through the transition that the Hargrove offer represents. The transition that sells 600 people's jobs to an asset-stripping firm." "Yes." Her voice was steady, but something in it was not. "But that's not how Langford will characterize it to the undecided board members. He'll characterize it as responsible financial planning versus emotional attachment." Ethan stood there and looked at her and thought about all of it. The gala, the supply locker, the Saturday mornings with the coffee and the blueprints, the storm and the wet dock and the sloop's bow line, and 4 minutes of work that had felt like something else entirely. "What do you want to do?" he said. "Finish the pitch. Make it bulletproof." She looked at him directly. "And be careful about appearances, which I know is an ugly thing to say, but the reality is that Langford is going to watch everything from here to the board meeting, and I cannot give him ammunition." He heard what she was saying. He heard what she wasn't saying. "That means fewer weekend meetings," he said. "It means more documented, formal meetings. If we're meeting, there should be a record. There should be other people present." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to pretend the design division work isn't happening. I'm asking for everything to be visible and above reproach." "That's reasonable." "It feels terrible," she said, with a sudden bluntness that was more like the harbor conversation than the boardroom language. "I want you to know I'm aware it feels terrible." He looked at her. The pen had stopped clicking. "I've spent 4 years not letting anything matter outside of Lily and the work," he said, carefully, landing it as close to true as he could without saying the rest of it. "I can manage a few more weeks of that." Something moved in her face. Not hurt, exactly. More the expression of someone who has heard something that confirms what they already suspected and finds the confirmation both reassuring and sad at the same time. "Thank you," she said. Same voice as before. The real one. He left. He drove home that night through the Charleston streets in the dark, and he thought about Langford watching from the top of the dock ramp, and Marcus saying something's happening, and Victoria saying it feels terrible. He thought about the 40-footer hull design in his laptop. 12 weeks of work now. The structural issues resolved one by one. The water entry angle that the old contact had called the best he'd seen in 5 years. He thought about 4 years of not letting anything matter except what was absolutely essential. and how he'd gotten so good at it that he'd confused the skill with the preference. He parked in front of the house. He sat in the car for a moment. Through the living room window, he could see the lamp that Mrs. Alcott always left on when she was next door, and he was out late. Yellow light, steady, the most reliable thing he knew. He went inside. Lily was asleep. Mrs. Alcott had left a note. She asked about the storm. I told her the boats were fine, and so were you. She seemed satisfied. You look tired. Sleep. EA. He stood in the kitchen reading the note. He thought about Victoria in the storm. The yellow rain jacket, the grease on her cheek. These are my boats. The absolute uncomplicated way she'd taken the bow line and held tension while he repositioned the cleat. He thought about Langford on the dock ramp and the 8 seconds that had carried the weight of a threat. He thought about how much he had to lose and how much the company had to lose, and how those two things were, for the next 6 weeks, completely and necessarily the same calculation. He turned off the kitchen light. He turned it back on. He opened his laptop and worked on the pitch until 2 in the morning, alone at the kitchen table in the yellow lamplight, with the storm-cleaned harbor somewhere beyond the dark window, and Lily asleep down the hall and the refrigerator drawing watching over all of it. 2 figures on a deck, optimistic sails, water that was the best blue a 7-year-old could manage. He worked until the numbers were right. Then he closed the laptop and went to bed. And outside the night was cold and clear and very still, the way it gets after something difficult has passed through and taken the excess with it, leaving only what was actually there all along. The 3 weeks between the storm and the board meeting had a particular texture. The tight, compressed quality of time, when there is too much to do and not enough of it, when every day feels like it's moving faster than you can manage and slower than you can stand. Ethan worked the pitch the way he'd worked hull designs at Georgia Tech, methodically, from the structure outward, building the skeleton before the surface. He started with the market analysis because numbers were the language board members trusted before they trusted anything else, and he wanted the first thing they encountered to be irrefutable. The custom performance yacht market on the East Coast, the supply gap created by Meridian's senior designer departures, and the Newport backlog. The price points for bespoke offshore designs versus production boats. The client demographics that had expanded over the past decade, not just old money anymore, but the kind of new money buyer who wanted provenance and story along with performance. He worked in the formal conference room now, as Victoria had asked, meetings scheduled through Diane, minutes kept, other people occasionally present. It was different from the Saturday mornings with the coffee and the blueprints, and they both knew it was different, and neither of them said so, which was its own kind of communication. The pitch grew. 40 pages became 60. The financial projections stabilized around numbers that were conservative enough to be credible and optimistic enough to matter. He drafted equipment upgrade specifications, staffing timelines, a phased revenue model that showed break-even at 14 months under moderate assumptions and 9 months if 2 anchor clients came in early. He had 2 anchor clients in mind. He hadn't told Victoria yet because he wasn't sure, and he didn't present things he wasn't sure of. The first was a private buyer he'd worked with briefly at Meridian, a man named Callahan who had been trying for years to commission a specific offshore racing design that no one had gotten right for him, and who had the budget and the patience of someone who would wait for quality. Ethan had run preliminary numbers on a design that addressed what Callahan had been asking for, and the numbers worked, and he thought Callahan might remember him. The second was more complicated. He was going through the design division's old client files on a Wednesday evening when he found the correspondence between Richard Sterling and a maritime preservation organization in Savannah that had been trying to restore a historically significant 1940s racing sloop. The project had been quoted but never contracted. Richard had died before it could move forward, and the division closure had ended the conversation. The organization was still active. Ethan had looked them up. The boat was still in dry storage in Savannah, still waiting. A restoration of that specific vessel, done right, done with documented methodology, would generate the kind of industry attention that no marketing budget could buy. It was the sort of project that got written up, the sort that established what a design team was actually capable of. He printed the correspondence and put it in the pitch folder. He was driving home that night, the folder on the passenger seat, when his phone rang through the car speakers. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. Ethan Callaway? Yes. My name is Gerald Fitch. I'm an attorney with Fitch and Holloway in Charleston. I apologize for the late hour. A pause, the kind that precedes something significant. I was the personal attorney for Richard Sterling. I've been trying to reach you for several weeks through your employer, but I understand there were some logistical complications in getting the message through. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. What message? Mr. Sterling left a sealed document in my keeping before his death. He instructed me to deliver it to you personally, not through the company, under specific circumstances. Another pause. Those circumstances are now present, Mr. Calloway. I believe you're aware of the board meeting scheduled for 3 weeks from now. The dashboard lights were very steady. The road was very ordinary. I'm aware, Ethan said. I think you should come to my office, Fitch said. At your earliest convenience. What I have to show you will change the nature of that meeting considerably. He went the next morning. Fitch and Holloway occupied a quiet suite of offices in a converted building on Meeting Street, the kind of firm that had been doing the same careful work for 3 generations and had no interest in announcing itself. Gerald Fitch was in his late 60s, compact and precise, with the manner of a man who had spent a career handling other people's most important moments and understood the weight of that. He shook Ethan's hand and poured coffee without asking, and set a sealed envelope on the desk between them. Before I open this, Ethan said, I need to understand something. Richard Sterling and we spoke twice. 3 times at most. I'm a rigger at his company. I don't understand why his personal attorney has a sealed document with my name on it. That's a reasonable question, Fitch said, and the document addresses it, but I can give you some context. He folded his hands. Richard came to me about 8 months before he died. He was already ill. He knew he was running out of time. He had 2 things he needed to do, and both of them required some legal architecture. He paused. The first was ensuring his daughter could maintain control of the company against board pressure after his death. He restructured his share ownership and established a trust. You're likely aware of that part. I know she has controlling shares. What's less known, intentionally less known, is the second thing. He looked at the envelope. Richard believed the company's future depended on the design division. He'd already started conversations with Langford about reopening it, and Langford had been, let's say, unenthusiastic. Richard was worried that after his death, Langford would find a way to prevent Victoria from having the leverage she needed to rebuild what he'd built. Fitch paused. So he created a secondary structure, a failsafe. Ethan looked at the envelope. He knew about your work at Georgia Tech, Fitch said. He'd followed your design publications before you left Meridian. When you applied to Sterling Maritime 3 years ago, he looked into your background. He thought you had the kind of talent and the kind of character. And he was very specific about character, Mr. Calloway. He used that word multiple times. That the division needed. A pause. He also thought, if I'm being direct, that you and his daughter might find each other useful, in various senses of the word. The coffee was good and Ethan wasn't tasting it. The document, he said. Fitch opened the envelope himself and slid 3 pages across the desk. The first was a letter in Richard Sterling's handwriting, clear and deliberate, the hand of someone who taught himself precision because imprecision cost money in his industry. The second and third were legal instruments. Ethan read the letter first because that was what the situation required. Richard Sterling had written it 14 months before his death. It was addressed to Ethan by name, which was strange to see. Dear Ethan at the top of a letter from a man he'd barely spoken to, from a man who had looked at his resume and decided something before they'd ever been in the same room. Richard wrote the way Ethan suspected he'd spoken, without decoration, without hedging, with the directness of someone who'd spent too many years on actual water to have patience for things that weren't real. He wrote about the company, what it had cost him, what it had given him, what he was afraid of losing. He wrote about Langford with the measured, almost clinical precision of a man who'd spent 20 years watching someone he'd made the mistake of trusting. He wrote about Victoria, briefly, because he was clearly not someone who found writing about love easy, with a restraint that made it more apparent, not less, that she was the part of his life he was most proud of and most afraid for. And then he wrote about Ethan. He wrote about reading the Georgia Tech paper. He wrote about watching Ethan's work from a distance and seeing the hull design instincts that Ethan had apparently been unable to see in himself. He wrote about the specific kind of person who abandons what they love to care for someone they love more, and how that quality, the willingness to give up your own thing for another person's life, was exactly the kind of character he'd spent 50 years trying to find in the people he worked with and rarely had. "I believe you are the right person to lead the design division when the time comes," Richard had written, "not because of your technical ability, though that is considerable, but because you understand what it costs to build something and what it costs to lose it, and you will not treat lightly what other people have given their lives to." Ethan read it twice. He kept his face still because that was what the room required. Then he looked at the legal instruments. The first was a shareholder trust document. Richard had, in the restructuring before his death, assigned a small but specific block of shares, 4% of the company's outstanding equity, into a trust controlled by a board of 3, Victoria, Fitch, and Ethan Callaway, with Ethan holding proxy voting rights in the event that Victoria's own votes were legally challenged or suspended. The trust had been structured so that it was invisible in routine financial filings, but would surface in the event of a contested shareholder action. The second instrument was a letter of intent, drafted and signed by Richard, designating Ethan as the preferred successor to lead the design division in the event of its reopening, with a compensation structure and equity stake that Ethan read 3 times because the numbers were not the numbers of a rigger. He set the papers down. The office was very quiet. Meeting Street outside was doing its ordinary morning things: traffic, voices, the city going about itself. "He did this without telling me," Ethan said. "Yes." He built a legal structure around a person he'd barely met. He was a thorough man. Fitch drank his coffee. "He said to me at the time that he'd spent his whole life making bets on people based on incomplete information and learning to read what the information meant. He said he was rarely wrong when he paid attention to the right things." A pause. "He said he was paying attention to you." Ethan looked at the letter again. "You understand what it costs to build something and what it costs to lose it." He thought about Claire. He thought about leaving Meridian. He thought about 3 years of rigging work and midnight hull calculations and Lily's drawing on the refrigerator. Richard Sterling had looked at all of that from a distance and decided it meant something specific. Ethan wasn't sure whether to be grateful or unsettled. He felt both, which was probably correct. "Victoria doesn't know about this," he said. "No, Richard's instructions were explicit on that point. He wanted you to know first, independently, before it became part of any strategy or negotiation. He wanted you to have the choice to walk away from it without any relational complication." "Why would I walk away from it?" Fitch looked at him with the mild expression of someone who has been a lawyer long enough to know that people walk away from things for reasons that look irrational from the outside and make complete sense from the inside. He thought there was a possibility that you might find the arrangement uncomfortable, that you might feel maneuvered. Ethan thought about that word. He sat with it. He thought about Victoria saying, "I was afraid if I pushed you toward it, you'd push back." He thought about Dell telling him she'd approved his hire personally, that she'd asked Marcus to keep him engaged. He thought about all of it as a sequence: the hire, the gala, the supply locker, the pitch, and tried to decide how much of it had been engineered and how much had been 2 people finding each other through the ordinary mechanics of proximity and attention. He couldn't fully separate the threads. Maybe that was okay. Maybe the threads being tangled together was just what life looked like when you paid attention to it honestly. "I'm not walking away, Wo," he said. Fitch nodded, unsurprised. "Then I'd suggest you decide how to tell Victoria, and when. The timing matters. It changes the legal posture at the board meeting, and Langford's people will find it eventually whether you surface it or not. Better on your terms." Agreed. He drove back to the yard. He sat in the parking lot for 15 minutes before going in. He thought about Richard Sterling at a kitchen table drawing boats he wasn't formally trained to draw. He thought about a man who had spent his life making bets on incomplete information and learning to read what mattered. He thought about a letter that had been waiting in a sealed envelope for over a year, patient as hardware in a supply locker, waiting for the right circumstances to surface. He got out of the car. He went to work. He did his shift and was present for all of it. The weld inspection on Dock 1, the consultation on the sloop's mast step that had been showing fatigue, the afternoon maintenance meeting where Chang remained pointedly focused on everything except Ethan. and he held the morning's information carefully, the way you hold something that needs time before it changes shape. He called Victoria that evening after Lily was in bed. "I need to meet with you tomorrow," he said. "Not a formal meeting, just the two of us." A pause. He heard something in the pause that wasn't quite caution and wasn't quite hope. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, but there's something you need to know, and I'd rather tell you in person." Another pause. "Okay, morning?" 6:30, the harbor bench, not the building. He'd chosen the bench because it was outside and visible, and there was nothing that could be done with a photograph of two people sitting on a public bench, and because some conversations needed the harbor and not an office. She was there when he arrived, earlier than 6:30, with coffee in 2 cups and her hair down, and the kind of stillness that meant she'd been sitting long enough to work through whatever she'd been turning over since his call. He sat beside her and told her everything. The call from Fitch, the envelope, the letter, the trust structure, the proxy voting rights, the letter of intent. He told it in sequence, plainly, without editorializing, and watched her face move through things he couldn't name fast enough. Surprise. Then something harder and more complicated. Then very still. When he finished, she didn't speak for a long time. The harbor moved in the early morning dark, the lights on the far shore making broken reflections on the water. A pelican went by very low, impossibly graceful for its size. "He never told me," she said finally. Her voice was level, but it was the levelness of something held in place deliberately. "No. He built a legal structure around you and never told either of us." "Yes." She was quiet again. He let her be quiet. He'd learned over the past weeks that she processed things in layers, that the first silence was working through the facts, and the second silence was working through what the facts meant, and interrupting either one was the wrong move. "Are you angry?" he asked, after the second silence had gone on long enough. She considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet." She looked at the water. "He trusted you before I did. He knew something about you before I knew anything except your personnel file." A pause. "That should feel strange." "Does it?" "A little." She turned her head and looked at him. "But less than it probably should, which maybe tells me something." She looked back at the water. He was right about people. He was almost always right about people. It was the one thing he was genuinely immodest about. He'd say, "I know a good person when I see one," and he'd say it without any embarrassment, like it was just a fact about himself that he'd verified enough times to be confident about. Ethan looked at the harbor. "He wrote something in the letter," he said carefully, "about you. He wrote, briefly, just a few sentences, that you were the part of his life he was most proud of." She was very still. "I thought you should know that," he said, since he apparently found it easier to write than to say. She looked at the water for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, stripped of the layer she usually kept between herself and the things that cost her. "He told me once," she said, "on one of his last good days. He said it badly. He started 3 times and gave up, and then just said it flat out. 'You're the thing I got most right.' And then he was embarrassed and changed the subject immediately." A small, fractured sound that was almost a laugh. That was his version of a speech. "It's a good version," Ethan said. She didn't say anything, but something in her shoulders settled, slightly, the way things settle when a weight you've been carrying gets acknowledged by someone else. They sat on the harbor bench in the dark with their coffee going cold, and the city coming awake around them, and it was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. It was something more specific than either of those words, something that had no clean name but was real enough that they both felt it, and neither of them tried to define it. "The board meeting," she said eventually. "The trust structure. Langford doesn't know about it." "No, Fitch kept it out of all standard filings. When it surfaces, it changes his vote count." Ethan had run the numbers the previous night, carefully. "His strategy depends on flipping 2 specific board members who are currently undecided. But if my proxy votes are in play, the math he's been counting on doesn't work anymore. He needs a larger majority than he has." She was processing it. He could see the legal architecture assembling itself behind her eyes. She was fast with this kind of thing, faster than she'd let on initially, and he'd stopped being surprised by it. "He'll fight it," she said. "He'll challenge the legitimacy of the trust. He'll argue it's irregular. It's completely legal, Fitch is thorough. Legal doesn't stop a challenge. It just means the challenge loses eventually. She turned toward him. He'll use the time between the challenge and the resolution to create enough uncertainty that the undecided members default to the safer option. Which is the sale? Which is the sale? She looked at her coffee cup. So we can't let him find out about the trust until the meeting itself. If he knows beforehand, he has time to architect a response. If it surfaces in the meeting, he doesn't have time. The vote happens before he can get counsel involved. She nodded slowly. That means Fitch says nothing and you say nothing until we're in that room. Fitch already agreed to that. He's been sitting on this for a year, Dace. Another 3 weeks is nothing. She was quiet for a moment. And the pitch, she said, the design division proposal, it needs to stand on its own regardless of the trust. Because if the only reason they vote against the sale is procedural, the proxy votes shifting the count, it's a delay, not a solution. We need them to want to keep the company. I know. He'd been thinking about this for weeks. That's why I need to tell you about Callahan and the Savannah boat. She looked at him. He told her about the 2 anchor clients. He told her about Callahan and the offshore racing design, and about the 1940s sloop in dry storage, the unfinished correspondence between her father and the preservation organization. He told her what a properly documented restoration of that vessel would mean for the division's profile, the publication attention, the credibility, the kind of signal to the market that no financial projection could manufacture. She listened the way she listened, completely, without interrupting, with the full attention of someone who understands that listening is a skill and practices it deliberately. When he finished, she said, "My father spent 4 months trying to get that project off the ground. The preservation organization, he genuinely cared about it. That boat is historically significant." "I know. I read the correspondence. If we can tell the board we have a letter of intent from that organization, I made some calls," he said, "through a contact who knows the organization's director. Nothing formal, so I didn't want to promise something we couldn't deliver. But the door is open. They're still looking for someone." She looked at him steadily. "You made those calls on your own time?" "Yes." "Without being asked?" "The pitch needed anchor clients," he said. "I found 2 that worked. It's part of the work." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and he held it back, and neither of them said what was actually being communicated, because the harbor bench in the early morning dark was not the place for that, and because there were 3 weeks left and the work was the thing that mattered, and because some things can be true without being said and stay just as true. "Okay," she said, "let's go close that door." They got the letter of intent from the preservation organization by the end of that week. Ethan drove to Savannah on a Thursday morning, met the organization's director, a meticulous woman named Dr. Elaine Marsh, who asked very precise questions and required very precise answers, and spent 4 hours walking through the restoration specifications, the design methodology, the timeline, and cost structure. Dr. Marsh had known Richard Sterling. She said so plainly, in the car park at the end of the meeting, as they were shaking hands. "He was going to do this right," she said. "I've been waiting for someone who would." "We will," Ethan said. She looked at him the way people look at someone when they're deciding whether the statement is credible. Richard trusted his word when he said things simply, she said. "No elaboration, no selling, just, this is true. That's how I could tell." She paused. "You talk the same way." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and she seemed to find that satisfactory. He drove back to Charleston with the signed letter of intent on the passenger seat where the original pitch folder had been, and he called Victoria from the car. "We have it," he said. A silence on the other end, then, "You have a signed letter of intent." "Yes." "From Dr. Marsh." "She said she's been waiting for someone who would do it right." Another silence. When Victoria spoke, her voice was doing the thing it did when she was containing something larger than the words. "Okay. Okay, that's... okay." A breath. "That changes the numbers. If we include that in the revenue projections, we're cash flow positive at 11 months. 9 months if Callahan comes in." "Have you contacted Callahan yet?" "Not yet. I wanted the Savannah letter first. Callahan will want to know we have capacity before he commits." "Contact him tomorrow." "Already planned to." The road ran back toward Charleston through the coastal flat country, the marsh grass going gold in the November light, The sky, the specific flat blue of a day that has decided to be honest about what season it is. Ethan drove with the window cracked and the letter of intent on the passenger seat and the specific feeling of a project that has been theoretical for weeks, becoming real and weighted and actual. He called Callahan the next morning. Callahan remembered him. Of course he did. Ethan had spent 3 months at Meridian working on preliminary specs for an offshore racing design that Callahan had ultimately not commissioned because the lead designer had gotten the keel geometry wrong in a way Ethan had flagged and been overruled on, and the boat had never been built. The keel geometry, Callahan said. You were right about that, by the way. The designer they brought in after you left confirmed it. I know. You were how old? 25? 24. A sound that might have been a laugh. What are you doing now? Ethan told him. He told him plainly. Sterling Maritime, the design division, the pitch to the board. He told him what he was building and what it would take and what kind of work the division would do. Callahan listened. Then he said, The offshore racer I never built. Yes. You still have the preliminary specs? I rebuilt them. They're better now. A pause. Are you the lead designer on this division? Ethan thought about Richard Sterling's letter, the legal instruments in Fitch's office, the letter of intent on the passenger seat in his car. Yes, he said. I am. Another pause. Longer. Send me what you have. I'll look at it this weekend. You'll have it tonight. He emailed the revised offshore racing specs to Callahan from the conference room that evening, with Victoria across the table working on the financial narrative, both of them in the focused quiet that had become their working register. When he sent the email, he said nothing to Victoria about it. She was mid-paragraph and he didn't interrupt. But she looked up anyway and looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression said she'd felt the shift, the specific atmospheric change of a thing that has been in motion finally arriving somewhere. Good? She said. Sent. Then let's finish this thing, she said, and went back to the paragraph. Callahan called Sunday afternoon with 4 questions, all technical, all good ones. The questions of someone who'd spent enough time with bad design work to know exactly which assumptions to test. Ethan answered them. Callahan asked a 5th question. When does the division open? After the board meeting, 3 weeks from now. That's your answer contingent on what? On the board voting to retain the company rather than sell it. A pause. What's the vote looking like? Close, but the pitch is solid. Callahan made a sound that was either skepticism or consideration, impossible to tell. I'll give you a letter of intent for the racing design, contingent on the board vote going the right way. Another pause. Which it will, if your pitch is what you say it is. It is, Ethan said. Then we have a deal. He sat in his kitchen after he hung up and looked at the ceiling and did the mental math one more time. 2 anchor clients with letters of intent, 11 months to cash flow positive. A legally airtight trust structure that would shift the vote count at the critical moment. A 60-page pitch that started with market analysis and ended with a design capability that no one on the East Coast could currently match. And Langford sitting somewhere in his well-appointed Charleston office, running his own calculations, convinced he had the numbers and the narrative both. He was wrong about the numbers. He was also wrong about the narrative, but that part was going to be harder to demonstrate. Ethan thought about what Marcus had said weeks ago. She's been fighting for this company since her father died. And he thought about a man drawing boats at a kitchen table, and a letter that had been patient in a sealed envelope for over a year, and a 7-year-old who had put herself on the deck of a boat that her father hadn't designed yet, and had absolutely no doubt it would exist. He thought about the thing he'd been holding at arm's length for 2 months, and how the arm was getting tired, and how the board meeting was 2 weeks away. And after the board meeting, the careful distance and the formal meetings, and the everything visible and above reproach would either still be necessary or would not. And he was aware of thinking about that more than was strictly professional. He opened his laptop. He looked at the whole design that had started as a midnight kitchen table exercise and had become, over 4 months of work, something he would stake his professional reputation on. He thought about Dr. Marsh saying, "You talk the same way he did." He thought about Richard Sterling at a kitchen table getting drainage solutions right that the professionals were getting wrong. He saved the file. Outside, November was doing its November things. cooling down, going honest, stripping the trees of whatever had been decorating them. The harbor was dark, and the house was quiet, and Lily was asleep with Captain, and the two of them were going to get through the next 2 weeks. And then there would be a board meeting, and everything was going to be decided. And he examined the feeling carefully, the way he checked a weld seam. He was not afraid. He was ready. That was new. That was, he thought, the feeling he'd been trying to locate for 4 years. The one that had gone underground along with the design software and the hull calculations and the version of himself that wanted things for himself specifically and without apology. Ready. He turned off the kitchen light. He went and checked on Lily. Sleeping, boneless, Captain tucked under her arm. He stood in her doorway for a moment in the dark. "Working on it, Bug," he said quietly. She didn't stir. He went to bed. The morning of the board meeting, Ethan woke up at 4:30 without an alarm. He lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the house. The furnace running, the harbor somewhere beyond the window doing its constant thing, indifferent to whatever was going to happen in a conference room at 9 a.m. Lily breathing through the baby monitor he still kept on his nightstand, a habit from her infant years that he'd never managed to break, not because he needed it anymore, but because the sound of her breathing in the dark was one of the few things in the world that was purely uncomplicated. He got up, he made coffee, he stood in the kitchen in the dark and drank half of it standing at the counter and looked at the refrigerator. Lily's drawing was still there. It had been there for 2 months. The tape on one corner had given up and he'd replaced it with a magnet, a pelican magnet that Mrs. Alcott had brought back from a trip to Hilton Head and given to Lily, who had installed it specifically to hold the drawing in place as if she'd anticipated that it would need reinforcing. 2 figures on a deck. The boat. The water that was the best blue a 7-year-old could manage. He looked at it for a while. Then he finished his coffee, showered, put on the dark shirt that Mrs. Alcott had ironed without being asked this time. She'd knocked on his door the previous evening and handed it to him without a word, which was its own kind of speech, and drove to the yard before the sun was up. The harbor was black and silver in the pre-dawn, the running lights of an early container ship moving through the dark like a slow thought. The cranes stood against the sky, which had gone from black to a deep blue that meant sunrise was maybe 40 minutes out. He walked the dock by himself, the way he sometimes did, not checking anything specific, just being in the place, letting it be familiar under his feet. He thought about Richard Sterling walking this same dock every Saturday morning. 8 a.m., rain or shine. He thought about a man who had spent his life making bets on incomplete information and learning to read what mattered. He walked to the end of the main dock and stood there until the sky started going orange at the edges, and then he turned around and went back to get ready for what the day required. The conference room on the 3rd floor filled up by 8:45. Ethan had been in it since 8, setting up the presentation, the 60-page pitch reduced to a clean 40-slide deck that Victoria had refined twice in the final week, each iteration sharper, the numbers crisper, the vision clearer. He'd printed hard copies for every board member because he'd learned from Victoria that certain people of a certain generation trusted paper in a way they didn't trust screens, and he wasn't going to lose a vote because someone couldn't read the font size on a projector. Marcus was not in the room, this wasn't his meeting, and they both knew it, but he'd texted Ethan at 7. "Everything you need is in there. Go get it." Ethan had texted back, "Thanks, Marcus. Don't thank me, just don't screw it up," which was, for Marcus, the closest thing to a battle cry. The board members arrived in 1s and 2s, 8 of them total. 4 who had been reliably in Victoria's corner, 2 who were Langford's, and 2 undecided. Ethan knew their names and general positions from the weeks of research, but seeing them in the room was different from knowing them on paper. The 2 undecided members were both in their late 60s, both with the careful faces of people who had learned to give nothing away in rooms like this. One of them, a man named Hargrove, no relation to the acquisition firm, just an unfortunate coincidence that Victoria had once mentioned with a tired humor, looked at the printed pitch document when Ethan set it in front of him and said nothing, which was either good or bad, and impossible to tell which. Langford arrived last. He walked into the room with the particular ease of someone who believes the outcome is already settled and is mainly here for the formality of confirmation. He was in a better suit than anyone else in the room, which was either intentional or reflexive, and he looked at Ethan with the same measured attention he'd deployed from the dock ramp 6 weeks ago. The look that said, "I have filed you, I know what you are, and I've already accounted for you." Ethan looked back at him steadily and said nothing, because nothing needed saying yet. Victoria came in at 8:58. She was in a dark blazer and her hair was pulled back, and she was carrying a leather portfolio that Ethan recognized as one of her father's. He'd seen it in the office photograph on the third-floor wall, Richard at some company milestone event, the same portfolio under his arm. Whether she'd done that deliberately or unconsciously, he didn't know. Either way, it was the right thing, and the room registered it without anyone saying so. She looked at Ethan once, briefly, and he gave her a small nod that meant everything's in order. She sat at the head of the table. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "We have a full agenda, so let's begin." The first hour belonged to Langford. He was good at this. Ethan had known that intellectually and now saw it demonstrated. Langford presented the Hargrove acquisition offer with the practiced patience of someone who has taken something complex and made it sound simple, and simple things sound inevitable. He had slides of his own, clean, financial, heavy on 10-year projections that assumed the maritime industry would continue its current pressure on mid-size independent yards. He had a letter from a financial analysis firm that validated the acquisition price as fair market value. He had language about fiduciary responsibility, about the duty of the board to shareholders, about the difference between sentiment and strategy. He never said the word emotion in relation to Victoria. He didn't need to. He'd structured the entire presentation so that the word arrived in the listener's mind without being placed there. The implicit argument was architectural, not frontal. Here are the numbers, here is the responsible decision, here is what a board that is thinking clearly would do. When he finished, one of his board allies asked a clarifying question that wasn't really a question, but a reinforcement, and Langford answered it with the ease of someone who'd rehearsed both sides of the exchange. The room was quiet. Victoria looked at Ethan. He stood up. He had thought, in the weeks preparing for this, about how to begin. He'd drafted openings and discarded them. He'd thought about what Richard Sterling would have done, and about what he himself was actually good at, and what he'd concluded was that the only version of this presentation that would work was the honest one. Not the performed version, not the strategic version, but the one where he said what was true and let the truth do its work. "I'm going to ask you to think about two different futures," he said, not philosophically, specifically, with numbers attached. He walked them through it. He started with the market analysis because that was the foundation, and the foundation had to be solid or nothing else mattered. He showed them the supply gap on the East Coast, the Meridian situation, the Newport backlog, the specific category of client that was currently underserved and had the budget and the appetite for what Sterling Maritime could offer. He showed them primary research, not projections built on projections, but actual conversations with actual people in the market. He showed them Dr. Marsh's letter of intent. He showed them the 1940s sloop in dry storage in Savannah and explained what a properly documented restoration meant to a design house's profile, why it mattered beyond the contract value, what it said to the market about what kind of work a team was capable of. He showed them Callahan's letter of intent. He watched Hargrove and the other undecided member, a woman named Patricia Ewan, a corporate attorney from Columbia who had joined the board 2 years ago and asked the sharpest questions of anyone in the room when the letters of intent appeared. Hargrove's face shifted in a small but specific way. Ewan leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Then he went to the financial model. He had built 3 scenarios, conservative, moderate, and aggressive. And he walked them through each one without overselling the aggressive case and without hiding the conservative one. The conservative case showed the division breaking even at 14 months. The moderate case showed it at 11. He talked about what drove the variance and where the risks actually lived, because he'd found that people trusted you more when you named the risks than when you pretended they didn't exist. He showed the employment impact, the 600 current jobs, the 40 to 60 additional positions the division would create in the first 2 years, the secondary economic activity in the surrounding community that those wages represented. He showed them what the Hargrove acquisition would actually look like at the operational level, because he'd done the research, and the research was not kind. 3 comparable acquisitions by Hargrove Capital over the previous 5 years. Average time from acquisition to asset divestiture, 22 months. Average employment retention after divestiture, 31%. He said this without inflection. He let the number sit. Langford stirred. That analysis takes those acquisitions out of context. The context is in the appendix, Ethan said, steady. Page 47. I've included the full acquisition records for all three companies, the pre-acquisition employment figures and the post-divestiture figures sourced from public filings. The math is straightforward. Langford went still. Ewan picked up her printed copy and turned to page 47. Ethan continued. He talked about the design division's specific competitive position, not generally, not aspirationally, but specifically, with reference to the market gap and the two anchor clients and the whole design work he'd been doing for the past 4 months. He talked about the Georgia Tech paper without calling it that, just referencing the specific technical innovations and their industry reception, and he was aware of Victoria's expression when he did. The look of someone hearing the thing they'd been trying to tell someone else finally coming out of that person's own mouth. And then he stopped with the pitch materials entirely. He closed the laptop. He stood at the head of the table and looked at the people in front of him. 8 people who had been handed the question of what happened to 600 lives and 37 years of built work. And he said what was actually true. Richard Sterling started this company with 2 dry docks and 12 years of debt, he said. He did it because he believed that building things that go on water was worth doing, and that the people who did it were worth keeping. He spent 18 years building a design division, not because it was the safest financial decision, but because it was the thing that made this company different from every other yard on this coast. He paused. He also made a decision, before he died, about what this company needed to survive. I want to tell you about that decision. He nodded to Diane, who was at the back of the room and had been trusted with the documents from Fitch. She came forward and set a folder in front of every board member. What you have in front of you is a shareholder trust established by Richard Sterling 14 months before his death. The trust assigns proxy voting rights to me under specific circumstances, circumstances that the legal team at Fitch and Holloway will confirm are fully operative as of today's meeting. He waited while they opened the folders. This changes the vote count for any motion today by 4% of outstanding equity. I want to be clear about what that means and what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean this vote is predetermined. It means that Richard Sterling built a safeguard for the company he spent his life creating, and that safeguard is now in play. The room was not quiet. It was the specific kind of loud that happens when people are trying to process something while maintaining the appearance of not processing it. Papers moving, whispered exchanges, the controlled electricity of surprise in a professional setting. Langford's expression did something that Ethan watched carefully. The silver-haired assurance didn't break. Men like Langford didn't break in rooms. He'd built the entire architecture of his power on never breaking in rooms. But something behind his eyes did the calculation and came up short. He knew the vote count. He'd been managing that count for months, and 4% had just moved. This is irregular, Langford said. His voice was controlled. A trust of this nature, structured outside standard board disclosure, is completely legal, said Fitch, who had been sitting in the corner of the room in the quiet way of lawyers who are waiting for their moment and have infinite patience for the waiting. I can walk through the legal basis in detail, Mr. Langford, or we can proceed with the vote and address challenges through the appropriate legal channels, which will take considerably longer than this meeting and will not change the trust's validity. Langford looked at Fitch. He looked at the documents. He looked at Ethan, and the look was different from the dock ramp. Not the measurement of whether someone was a manageable problem, but the recognition of someone who had not been correctly accounted for. This is an attempt to manipulate the governance process, Langford said, turning to the full board. It's a shareholder trust, Victoria said, and her voice was the steadiest thing in the room. Established by my father, the company's founder, according to his legal right as a controlling shareholder, documented and witnessed and filed with the appropriate attorney. You can characterize it however you like, Victor. The documents say what they say. Hargrove spoke for the first time since the presentations had started. He was looking at the trust document and then at page 47 of the pitch, and his expression had moved through several things and arrived somewhere deliberate. I'd like to ask a question about the design division projections, he said. Not Langford. Hargrove. Asking Ethan. Ethan answered it. It was a good question. About the material cost assumptions in year 2, about whether the labor projections accounted for the current market for experienced naval architects. He answered it precisely, with the numbers, and then he answered the follow-up that Hargrove didn't ask, but that was implicit in the first question. Ewan had 2 questions of her own, both sharp, both specific. He answered them. One of Langford's allies asked something that was framed as a question, but was actually a challenge about the feasibility of competing with larger design houses, and Ethan heard the frame and addressed the frame first, before answering the substance, which he could see Ewan register in the way she wrote something on the edge of her paper. Langford said nothing else during the questions. He sat with the controlled stillness of a man managing his expression very carefully, and Ethan understood, because he'd been watching people on boats in bad weather for 3 years and had gotten good at reading the difference between someone who was working through options and someone who had run out of them, that Langford was not managing a strategy anymore. He was managing a loss. The vote took 12 minutes, 6 to retain the company and pursue the design division plan, 2 for the acquisition. Hargrove and Ewan had both voted with Victoria. The math with the proxy votes would have been 7-1, but it hadn't needed to be. The proxy votes had done their real work, not in the counting, but in the moment Ethan had placed the trust document in front of the room, the moment that shifted the atmosphere, that changed what was possible, that reminded every person at that table that Richard Sterling had thought enough about this company's future to plan for it from beyond his own life. The proxy votes had been the foundation. The pitch had been the building, and what had mattered was that both of them were solid. Langford stood after the vote was announced. He picked up his folder. He looked at Victoria and said, with a flatness that contained more than flatness, "You'll hear from my attorney regarding the trust structure." "You know where Fitch's office is," Victoria said, not unkind, not triumphant, just settled. He left. His 2 allies left with him. The remaining 6 board members sat in the room for another hour, moving into the practical business of what came next. The timeline for the design division launch, the leadership structure, the formal vote to ratify Ethan's appointment as lead designer, which passed unanimously and which Ethan accepted with the minimum words necessary because he was still holding together the part of himself that wanted to put his face in his hands and breathe for a while. When the room finally cleared, Victoria and Ethan were the last ones in it. She was standing at the window with her father's portfolio in one hand, looking at the harbor. The November morning had come in clear and cold, the water doing its copper-green thing in the low sun, the cranes standing against a sky that had decided to be generous. He stood beside her. For a while, neither of them said anything, because the past 4 months had required so much saying, and there was something clean about not having to say anything for a minute. "He knew," she said finally. "Yes. He built all of it, the trust, the hire, the letter." She shook her head slowly. "He knew what he was doing." "He was making bets on people," Ethan said. "He trusted his read." She looked at the harbor. Was he right? He knew what she was asking, not about the trust, not about the design division, about the other thing, the thing underneath all of it, the thing they'd been navigating around for 4 months with the careful precision of people who understood that the stakes were real and the timing had to be right. "Yes," he said. He was right. She turned and looked at him. And here was the thing about Victoria Sterling that Ethan had understood for weeks and not been able to say. She was not an easy person. She was smart in ways that made some people uncomfortable, and she cared about the right things with an intensity that didn't leave a lot of room for pretense. And she carried her losses the way people carry losses when they don't have anyone to put them down with. Carefully, quietly, without complaint, which made them heavier rather than lighter. She had been running on competence and stubbornness for years, and she was 30 years old and looked it only in the eyes, which had seen too much for someone her age. She was not easy. She was exactly who she was. And Ethan had spent 4 months in close enough proximity to understand that who she was and who he was were people who, put together, were better at being human than they were separately. He didn't say any of that. He didn't need to. He just said, "I think your father was right about most of it." She held his gaze. Something in her face did the complicated thing one last time. All the layers at once, the grief and the sharpness and the something else. And then it settled, not into simplicity, but into something more honest than complexity. She reached out and put her hand over his, briefly, the way people touch when they mean something they can't say yet and know there will be time to say it. Then she picked up her portfolio and said, "Come on, we have to tell Marcus." He smiled. He actually smiled, the kind that starts in the chest before it gets to the face. "He's probably been standing outside the door for the last hour," Ethan said. "Absolutely," she said. He was. Marcus was leaning against the wall in the corridor outside the conference room with a coffee cup and the expression of a man maintaining studied nonchalance with moderate success. When they came out, he straightened up and looked at Victoria and then at Ethan. "Well?" he said. 6'2", Victoria said. Marcus made a sound that was all the things he normally didn't say out loud in professional settings, and then composed himself. "Langford?" "Gone," Ethan said. "He'll challenge the trust. Fitch will handle it." Marcus nodded. He looked at the two of them standing in the corridor, and he did the thing he did. Reading the room, reading the people in the room, registering what was and wasn't being said. His expression did something quiet and specific that was about satisfaction, but was also about more than the vote. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He raised his coffee cup. "Your father would be happy," he said to Victoria. She nodded. She didn't say anything, but the nod was the kind that carries weight. "There's a yard full of people who've been trying to work with their ears pointed at this building all morning," Marcus said. "Go tell them," Victoria said. "You should be the one to tell them." He looked surprised. "Me? You've been holding this place together for 11 years. Yes, you." She almost smiled. "Go." Marcus went. They stood in the corridor and listened to him go down the stairs, and 30 seconds later they heard the specific sound of 600 people being told something they'd been waiting to hear. Not a cheer exactly, more the release of sustained collective breath, a sound like a wave breaking and pulling back at the same time. It came up through the building the way sounds do in old buildings, through the walls and the floors, full and warm and entirely human. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment. Ethan watched her. He watched the sound move through her. He watched her absorb it, all of it, the vote and the company and her father's letter and 11 years of Marcus and the harbor and what comes next. And he watched her face do the thing it had been doing when she'd first come outside at the gala and looked at the yard with the string lights and the workers in their good shirts. Pride and grief together. Love for something that cost what it cost. She opened her eyes. "Come down with me," she said. "To the yard." They went down. The yard received them the way yards receive good news, not with formal ceremony, but with the honest, unpolished emotion of people who had been genuinely afraid and were genuinely relieved, which is a combination that produces an authenticity no staged event ever manages. People shook hands and said things and didn't say other things, and Rosario from the storm grabbed Victoria's arm and said something that made her laugh unexpectedly. A real laugh, unguarded, that Ethan filed away in some part of himself as something he wanted to hear again. Dell, the retired machinist, was there. He walked up to Ethan and shook his hand and said, "Richard was right about you," and then walked away before Ethan could respond, which was very much Dell's manner, and also, Ethan thought, the highest compliment he could remember receiving. Ethan stood in the yard in the November morning light and felt something he'd been trying to put his finger on for weeks and finally had a word for. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness was too light a word for something this weighted. More like rightness, the specific earned feeling of being in the correct place, which is a rarer thing than it sounds and which requires losing your way badly enough to understand what finding it actually feels like. He thought about Claire. He allowed himself to think about her fully, in the middle of the yard with the harbor behind him, and 600 people around him, and his own professional future changed by one morning in a conference room. He thought about her and held the thought without flinching, and without letting the grief become a room he had to stay in. He had loved her completely. He had been broken by losing her. He had rebuilt himself smaller and more careful and had done that rebuilding for the right reason. Lily, always Lily. And it had been necessary, and it had also, in the way of things that are necessary, cost him more than he'd wanted to admit. He was 32 years old. He had a lot of years left. He thought Claire would have told him that. He thought she would have used those exact words, probably while doing something else, probably without looking at him, which was how she delivered things she meant most seriously. Ethan, you have a lot of years left. Stop treating them like a maintenance budget. He almost said something out loud and stopped himself. But he was smiling when he stopped. He picked Lily up from school that afternoon in the same car, on the same street, at the same chain-link fence. She came out of the building with Captain and a drawing and the absolute confidence of a small person who knows exactly who she's looking for. She got in the car and looked at his face. "You did the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The different face. Not the worried face, and not the fine face. The other one." "I don't know what that means." "Yes, you do." She buckled her seatbelt. "Mrs. Alcott says it's the face people get when something actually went right." She examined this with the judicial consideration she applied to most things. "Did something actually go right?" "Yeah," he said. "It did." "At work?" "At work." She processed this with characteristic Lily thoroughness. "Is the boat division going to happen?" He looked at her. "Where did you hear about the boat division?" "Mrs. Alcott." "Mrs. Alcott talks too much." "That's what you always say." "Is it happening?" "Yes," he said. "It's happening." She considered this. Then, "Are you going to design the boats?" "Yes." She sat with this for a moment, out the window at the passing Charleston streets, and then she turned back with the expression of someone who has had a theory confirmed and finds the confirmation satisfying rather than surprising. "I knew," she said simply. "Did you?" "I told you. On the drawing. That's you on the boat." She held Captain up at the windshield as if showing him the view. Captain knew too. He drove them home and made dinner and sat at the table with her while she did homework, and the evening was ordinary in all the ways evenings should be ordinary. Messy and incomplete, dishes in the sink, homework that went sideways and had to be redone. A minor disagreement about screen time that he handled badly and then better. Not a perfect evening. A real one. After Lily was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He looked at the whole design file. 4 months of work, the 40-footer that had started as midnight therapy and become something else. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened a new file. He started drawing, not the 40-footer. Something new, the shape of a hull he'd been carrying in his head for weeks, ever since the Savannah meeting, something that had been forming around the specific design challenges of the 1940s sloop restoration. A different set of problems, a different kind of thinking, and underneath it the beginning of what might eventually be something original. His own work, fully his, no echoes of Meridian or Georgia Tech or anyone else's approach. He worked until 11. He ate cereal standing at the counter because he'd forgotten dinner. He went back and worked until midnight. When he finally closed the laptop, the house was very quiet and the harbor was doing what it always did, and Lily was breathing steadily through the monitor. He looked at the refrigerator. The drawing had been there for 2 months. The Magnet Pelican was holding its corner, the boat with its optimistic sails and its 2 figures on the deck. He thought about Victoria's hand on his in the conference room. Brief, specific, nothing performed about it. He thought about what it cost to build something and what it cost to lose it, and what it meant that he was standing in his kitchen at midnight with something new in his laptop and something possible in his chest, and a 7-year-old asleep down the hall who had been drawing his future on construction paper before he could see it himself. The truth was this: he was not a finished person. He had scar tissue in places that still pulled in cold weather, and he was bad at asking for help, and he had spent 4 years in a smaller version of himself because smaller had felt safer, and there were still mornings when the house was too quiet, and the coffee was just coffee, and not any of the other things coffee becomes when someone else is making it. He was not finished. Neither was she. Neither of them would be, probably, which was the part no one tells you about starting over. That you don't start over exactly. You start forward. You bring the weight with you, and the weight teaches you things. And what you build with those things is different from what you would have built before, and different is not lesser. It is just what is true. He turned off the kitchen light. He went and looked in on Lily one more time, the way he always did, the nightly ritual of a man who had understood since the moment she arrived in the world that she was his clearest proof that some things survive what should have broken them. She was asleep. Captain was tucked. The world was, for this moment, in its right arrangement. He went to bed. Outside, the November harbor moved under the stars. The cranes stood their patient watch. The boats were tied and riding easy at the dock, the workboats, the sloops, the restored hulls, and the ones still waiting, all of them asking nothing except to float and hold their shape and do what they were built to do. 3 months later, on a bright February morning that came in cold and clear with the kind of light that makes the water look like something valuable, a 52-foot yacht slid down the launch ramp at Sterling Maritime and entered the harbor for the first time. She was not the 40-footer. She was something Ethan had designed in the months between the board meeting and her keel laying, working from the principles he'd been developing since the midnight kitchen table, and she was the first vessel to carry the mark of the Sterling Maritime Design Division in 5 years. The launch was not a large event. It didn't need to be. There was a crowd on the dock, workers, board members, Dr. Marsh from Savannah, Callahan, who had driven down from Charleston proper to see what his money was going to be building next, Marcus with his coffee, Diane, who had left her desk for possibly the first time in professional memory. Lily was there. She was wearing her good coat and holding captain and standing on the dock with the focused attention of a 7-year-old who has been waiting for a specific thing and is not going to miss it now that it's happening. When the yacht entered the water and the hull settled and the lines came taut, and she sat there exactly as she should, balanced, true, doing what she'd been built to do, Lily made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite anything describable, just the sound of a child who has been proven right about something that mattered. Ethan was beside her. He watched the hull settle on the water. He saw the waterline sit exactly where he'd put it in the calculations. Not perfect. Nothing was perfect. There would be adjustments in sea trials. There were always adjustments, but close enough, solid enough, real. Victoria was on his other side. She was looking at the yacht and then at him, and her expression was the one he'd been learning to read for 5 months. The one that was too many things at once. The complicated one. Except that this morning it was more settled than he'd seen it. Not simpler. Just more at peace with its own complexity. "She's good," Victoria said. "She'll be better after trials," he said. "She's good now." A pause. He would have loved her. He didn't ask who she meant. He knew. Lily slipped her hand into his. He held it without looking down. She was watching the yacht. He was watching the yacht. They were both watching the yacht, which was as it should be. "Dad?" Lily said very quietly. "Yeah." "This is the boat," she said, "from the drawing." He looked down at her. She was looking at the yacht with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who understands very clearly that the world she was promised is the world she was owed, and here it is, exactly as described. He looked back at the harbor, at the yacht riding the cold February water, at the light making something valuable of the surface. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "It is." Victoria's hand found his other hand. He held both of them, his daughter and this woman, the two weights that had been pulling at him all year, from different directions at first and then, somehow, from the same one. And he stood on the dock in the February morning and let the moment be what it was. Not perfect. Never perfect. The yacht would need adjustments. The design division had 14 months to break even, and the pressure of that was real, and the work was going to be hard, and there would be days when the numbers didn't cooperate, and days when the harbor smelled like rain that hadn't arrived, and everything felt uncertain. And Langford's legal challenge was still working its way through the process, which Fitch had said was normal and manageable and would resolve the way these things resolved when the documentation was sound, which it was. And Ethan was still a man who cracked his knuckles in cold weather and had a scar from a winch cable and sat at kitchen tables at midnight and was bad at asking for help. And Victoria was still a woman who carried her losses too quietly and worked before 6 and clicked her pen when she was thinking through something difficult, and neither of them was going to be fundamentally different from what they were. But the yacht was on the water, and the company was standing, and Lily had been right. That was the truth of it, the simple, costly, earned truth. Some things you build from scratch, some things you rebuild from what was left. And sometimes, not often, not without a great deal of loss along the way, you find that what was left is better material than what you started with, because it's been tested and it held, and you know exactly what it can bear. Ethan Callaway stood on the Charleston dock in the February light and knew, with the specific body knowledge he trusted most, the same knowledge that read weather and hull stress and human character, that he was in the right place. He'd been away from it for a while. He was back. The harbor moved. The yacht rode the water. The light came through clean and clear and honest, the way light does when the season has finally made up its mind. And Lily let go of his hand and ran to the end of the dock to get a better look, her coat flying, captain tucked under one arm, absolutely certain in the way of small people who have not yet learned to doubt the things they know.